As usual, if you like these stories or it felt meaningful to you, feel free to like, share, and comment your thoughts below, as well as subscribe to our channel. It could be a huge support for our work. Now, let's just enjoy the stories.
She didn't mean to text him. She didn't even know his name. But when the most dangerous man in the city said, "Don't move, I'm coming," her world was never the same again. A woman, a wrong number, and a crime lord who decided she was worth saving. What happened next will break your heart before it heals it. This is a story about survival, power, and the kind of love that rewrites a man's entire soul. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The rain came down like it had a grudge. It hammered the cracked windows of Emily Carter's third-floor apartment in a relentless gray curtain, turning the streetlights below into blurred smears of yellow and white. Inside, the radiator groaned and ticked without producing any real warmth. The walls of the apartment were thin, thin enough that Emily could hear her upstairs neighbor's television murmuring through the ceiling, thin enough that she could hear the couple two doors down arguing about money. Again, always about money. But Emily wasn't listening to any of that tonight. Tonight, she was listening to the sound of her own breathing. Shallow, careful, each inhale a negotiation with the pain spreading across her left side. She was on the kitchen floor. She didn't remember falling there exactly. One moment she had been standing near the counter, and the next the floor had come up to meet her with a cold, hard certainty that reminded her this was real. This was happening. This was not one of the nightmares she'd been having for months. The ones where she woke up at 3 in the morning, heart slamming, convinced she could hear his footsteps in the hallway outside. This was not a nightmare. The front door of her apartment was hanging at a broken angle, the top hinge torn clean from the frame. A chair lay on its side near the couch. Two of the kitchen cabinet doors had been wrenched open and left that way. Their contents, a box of cereal, a can of soup, a mug she'd bought at a thrift store because she liked the tiny painted bluebirds on it, scattered across the counter. The mug was broken now. She could see it from where she lay. Just shards of ceramic and two tiny painted bluebird wings sitting in the spilled remains of whatever had been in it. Daniel. His name surfaced in her mind like something ugly floating up through dark water. Daniel Marsh, 29 years old, sales associate at a real estate firm downtown. Charming in social settings, the kind of man who held doors and laughed at other people's jokes and remembered how you took your coffee. She had dated him for 14 months. She had thought she loved him. She had spent the first 4 months of those 14 trying to understand why she flinched sometimes when he raised his voice, trying to convince herself that the tightness in her chest when she heard his key in the door was just anxiety, just her own damage, not a warning. She understood now. 6 months after the breakup, she understood with perfect, brutal clarity. He had found her new address 3 weeks ago. She didn't know how. She had changed her phone number, changed her email, asked her friends not to tell him anything, stopped going to the coffee shop near her old apartment where she used to see him on Saturday mornings. She had done everything the online articles said to do, every checklist item she'd found at 2 in the morning while sitting in the dark with her laptop on her knees, reading about how to disappear from someone who didn't want to let you go. And still he had found her. He had knocked on her door tonight at 7:43. She knew the time because she'd looked at her phone the moment she heard the knock, a reflex, a documentation instinct she'd developed over the past months, some survival part of her brain understanding that if she ever needed to prove something, she would need times, dates, specifics. 7:43. She had not opened the door. She had stood in the hallway of her apartment with her back against the wall beside the door, not breathing, telling herself he would go away. He had not gone away. The sound of the door giving way, that specific violent crack of wood and metal, was something Emily suspected she would hear in her sleep for a very long time. What followed was a blur of sound and impact in her own voice, which she barely recognized, screaming things she couldn't now recall. She remembered the cold tile of the kitchen floor. She remembered the smell of his cologne. Something expensive, something she used to like. She remembered the ceiling above her and the fluorescent kitchen light with the one flickering bulb she'd been meaning to replace for 2 weeks. She remembered the moment he left, not because of anything heroic, not because someone intervened. He left because the neighbor across the hall had opened her door and shouted that she was calling the police. And Daniel Marsh, whatever else he was not the kind of man who wanted a police report with his name on it. He had straightened his jacket. She remembered that detail with a strange, crystalline sharpness. He had straightened his jacket, looked at Emily on the floor, and walked out of her broken door like a man leaving a meeting that had run slightly long. And then there was only the rain and the radiator and the sound of her own breathing. Emily lay still for a long moment. She made herself take inventory. Her ribs, left side, pain with every breath, possibly cracked, possibly just bruised. She had no way to know. Her wrist, tender when she flexed it, but she could flex it, so probably not broken. Her face? She raised her right hand and touched her cheekbone, and her fingers came away with a faint trace of blood from a cut above her eyebrow where her temple had glanced off the counter edge on the way down. She was alive. She repeated that to herself with a quiet, focused intensity, the way a person repeats a fact they need to believe. She was alive. She was conscious. She was thinking clearly enough to take inventory, which meant she was okay enough to do the next thing. The next thing was her phone. Her phone was on the floor 4 feet away. It had slid there during the struggle. The screen was cracked by a starburst fracture across the lower right corner, but when she reached out and pressed the button, it lit up. It took her 3 attempts to get to her contacts. Her hands were shaking badly enough that her thumbprint wasn't registering, and she had to tap in her passcode manually, mistyping twice before the screen finally unlocked. She needed to call her friend. Vivian. Vivian Torres, who lived 20 minutes away and drove a beat-up silver Honda and would come without asking a single question. That was the plan. She had talked through this with herself once, in that cold late-night way you talk yourself through things you don't want to need. If something happens, call Vivian. She scrolled to Vivian's name. She pressed call. Her hands were shaking. The cracked screen had partially obscured the contact list, and the pain in her ribs was doing something odd to her concentration, making the world tilt slightly at the edges, making the small text on her phone swim in ways it normally did not. She pressed call. She held the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Emily pulled the phone back and stared at it. Her chest hurt. Her eyes were burning. She was not going to cry. Not yet. Not while she was still on the floor, not until she had done the thing that needed doing. She went back to her contacts. Scrolled again. She found the name, or thought she found it, and typed a message instead of calling, because her voice felt unreliable right now, because if Vivian picked up and she heard a voice asking if she was okay, she wasn't entirely sure she would hold together. She typed, "I need help. I'm at my apartment. Please come." Something happened. Her thumb hovered over send. She pressed it. The message showed as delivered. Emily let her head drop back against the cabinet behind her. The phone pressed to her chest, and she breathed through the pain and the adrenaline and the strange cotton wool quiet that had settled over the apartment now that he was gone. She stared at the rain-streaked window above the sink. She stared at the broken mug. She stared at the 2 tiny painted bluebird wings. Her phone buzzed. The message came back fast. Too fast for Vivian, who was the kind of person who typed with 2 fingers and took 5 minutes to send a 3-word reply. Emily looked at her screen. The number displayed above the message was not Vivian's number. It was not any number she recognized, and the message read, "Don't move, I'm coming." Emily stared at those 4 words for a long moment, long enough that the screen dimmed and she had to tap it awake again. "Don't move, I'm coming." Her first thought was that she had misread. Her vision was off, her hands were shaking, the screen was cracked. She had dialed wrong, sent to the wrong contact, some sort of error. She scrolled up. She reread what she had sent. "I need help. I'm at my apartment. Please come." Something happened. She looked at the number again. It was not in her contacts. No name was attached to it. Just 11 digits, unfamiliar, a Chicago area code. She typed back with fingers that trembled only slightly less than before. "Who is this? I think I messaged the wrong number. I'm sorry." The reply came in under 30 seconds. "You messaged the right number tonight. Don't open the door for anyone until I get there. I'll knock 3 times. Emily read that message 4 times. Something was wrong with this situation in ways she was still too shaken and too hurt to fully process. A stranger, a complete stranger, had received her distress message, had replied within seconds, and was now apparently on his way to her apartment. The rational part of her brain, the part that had spent 6 months building safety protocols and reading threat assessment articles and practicing what to say to the 911 dispatcher, said, "This is dangerous. Do not let a stranger into your home." The other part of her brain, the part that was pressed against a cabinet on a cold kitchen floor with a cracked phone screen and a broken door hanging off its hinges and blood drying above her eyebrows, said, "You already had the dangerous thing happen. You're still here. Someone is coming." She didn't reply to the unknown number. She held her phone and she waited. 8 minutes later, there were 3 knocks on her damaged door. Quote. Emily pulled herself upright using the cabinet handle, the movement sending a bright spike of pain across her left side that made her breath catch audibly. She crossed the kitchen, holding herself carefully, stepped over the fallen chair in the living room, and made herself look through the gap where the broken door hung half open before she said anything. What she saw was not what she expected. She had expected. She wasn't sure exactly what she had expected. Something that matched the strangeness of the situation. Something visibly dangerous or visibly strange. The man standing in her hallway was tall. That was the first thing she registered, because the hallway of her building had a ceiling height of about 8 feet, and this man seemed to occupy a significant portion of it. Not freakishly, but in the way that certain people simply carry height as a natural authority, as though the air around them reorganizes itself accordingly. He was wearing a dark suit, charcoal gray, with a white shirt and no tie, the top button undone, like someone who had been dressed for a formal event and had stopped caring about the formalities some hours ago. His hair was dark, cut close on the sides and slightly longer on top. His jaw was the kind that sculptors seem to have invented as a stylistic challenge, all clean angles and quiet intention. He looked at Emily through the gap in the door. His eyes were dark, very dark, and they moved over her with a rapid clinical assessment that had nothing romantic or predatory about it. It was the assessment of someone who was cataloging damage. Damage he seemed to find significant. "Emily Carter," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, without any of the uncertainty she might have expected from a person standing outside a stranger's apartment on a rainy weeknight. She stared at him. "How do you know my name?" "Your contact is saved in the number you messaged. Your name came through when your message arrived." He paused. "I'd like to come in. I'd also like to understand what happened to your door." Emily looked at the door, back at him. "You could be anyone." "Yes," he said without any apparent offense. "My name is Adrian Valente. You may have heard it, you may not have. Right now, that matters less than the fact that you're bleeding above your right eye, you're holding your left side, and your front door looks like it was introduced to someone's shoulder at high velocity." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to hurt you. If I intended to do that, I wouldn't have announced my arrival with 3 knocks." Emily considered that logic. Under normal circumstances, she would have found it deeply insufficient. But she was standing on a bruised floor with a broken door and a stranger who was currently the only person in the world who had replied to her distress message. And the apartment was cold, and the radiator was still ticking uselessly, and her ribs hurt with every breath. She stepped back. She let him in. Adrian Valente moved through her apartment with a quiet, contained efficiency that Emily found herself watching despite everything. He checked the front door, examined the torn hinge with a brief, hard look that suggested it communicated something to him, then crossed to the kitchen and crouched beside the overturned chair and the scattered contents from the cabinets without touching anything. He was checking the scene, she realized, reading it the way someone reads a room when they've spent time understanding what rooms look like after violence. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly. More the way someone speaks when they've assessed that standing is costing you more than you're letting on. Emily sat on the couch. The cushions sank under her. She realized she was cold. Deeply, penetratingly cold, in the way that comes after adrenaline vacates the body and leaves nothing but the raw reality of the temperature. Adrian went to her kitchen, opened the cabinet under the sink, and produced a clean dish towel from a hook she hadn't noticed in 4 months of living here. He ran it under cold water, wrung it out. He brought it to her and offered it without any ceremony. "For your face," he said. She took it, pressed it to the cut above her eyebrow. The cold felt like relief. Adrian pulled the wooden chair from near her small dining table, turned it around, and sat on it backwards with his forearms resting across the top rail. He looked at her. Not with pity, she noted, with something more like attention, the kind of attention that carries weight. "Tell me what happened," he said. And Emily, who had not cried yet, who had held herself together through the entire nightmare of the past 2 hours through sheer determination, found that something in the uncomplicated directness of that request cracked something open inside her. She told him. Not everything, not all at once. In pieces, starting with the knock at the door, going back, when he asked a quiet question, to the breakup, the messages, the new address she thought he didn't have. She told him about the door giving way, about the kitchen floor, about straightening his jacket. That detail, for some reason, was the one that cost her the most. Telling it out loud, he straightened his jacket like I was an inconvenience, like I was a meeting that ran long. That was when her voice broke. Not into sobs, just into a single rough fracture that she closed down quickly. Adrian said nothing while she spoke. He did not offer the kind of verbal reassurances that people offer when they don't know what to do with someone else's pain. That's terrible, how awful. I can't imagine. He simply listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor. Then he said, "What's his name?" "Why?" "Because I'm going to need it." Emily looked at him. What are you going to do?" Adrian raised his eyes. Something in them was very steady and very dark and very much older than the conversation they were having. "I'm going to make sure he understands that finding your address was the last interesting decision of his life." The words landed in the apartment with a soft, absolute quality that made Emily's skin prickle. She had known, theoretically, from the moment he said Adrian Valente, that she was potentially in the company of someone whose name attached to certain kinds of stories. She lived in the city. She had worked near the waterfront for 2 years as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company. You heard things. Names got attached to things. Power had a texture in this city, and it tended to have a shape, and one of those shapes was the quiet certainty in the voice of the man currently sitting backwards on her kitchen chair. "I don't want anyone hurt," she said, because she needed to say it, because it was true. Adrian looked at her for a moment. "I know you don't," he said. "That's actually one of the things that's going to make this more difficult." He stood. "I have a car downstairs. And 2 people I trust absolutely. I'd like to take you somewhere you can be looked at properly and sleep without worrying about the door." Emily looked at the hanging door. The hanging, broken, entirely non-functional door that Daniel Marsh had introduced to his shoulder. "I don't know you," she said. "You know my name," he said. "I know your name," she agreed. "I've heard things about your name." Adrian didn't pretend to misunderstand her. He looked at her directly. "Everything you've heard is probably true," he said. "I'm not a safe man. I run businesses that don't operate within conventional definitions of legal. I have enemies. I have people who work for me and people who work against me, and I have spent a significant portion of my adult life in rooms most people don't want to know exist." He paused. "I also knocked 3 times. I also came here because you sent a message that said you needed help, and I was raised with the apparently inconvenient belief that when someone asks for help, you go." He looked at her steadily. "You can stay here. You can call the police. I'll leave before they arrive because that would be complicated for both of us. Or you can come with me. I'll take you somewhere secure. I'll have someone look at your injuries, and tomorrow morning you can make any decision you want about what comes next. But tonight, with that door off its hinges," he glanced at it, "tonight, you shouldn't be alone here." Emily followed his gaze to the broken door. The rain was still coming down outside. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. She felt her body tense in a full system response before she could stop it. Her shoulders rising, her breath tightening, her weight shifting towards something that was not quite balance. She looked at the broken mug on the counter. "Okay," she said. It was perhaps the most complicated single word she had ever spoken. Intuition. The car waiting at the curb outside her building was not what she expected. And then again, on reflection, it was exactly what she should have expected. It was a black vehicle, large, long, the kind with tinted windows that carried the specific visual weight of seriousness. There was a driver behind the wheel whose name Emily would learn later was Marco, a broad-shouldered, quiet man in his 40s with gray at his temples and the careful manner of someone who has spent a long time being trusted with things that matter. Standing at the rear passenger door was a woman, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, somewhere in her mid-30s, dressed in dark clothing that managed to look both practical and intentional. "This is Reyes," Adrian said as they reached the car. Reyes looked at Emily. The same quick clinical assessment, the same cataloging of damage, and said without inflection, "She needs a doctor." "Yes," Adrian said. "Ribs? Possibly." "I'll call Lena," Reyes said, and she was already on her phone before the door was open. Emily got into the car. The seat was warm. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something else. Rain and night air, she realized, from when Adrian had been outside. She sat against the door and watched the city slide past the tinted windows as Marco pulled into traffic and the lights of her neighborhood receded behind them. Adrian sat across from her, or rather diagonally. The backseat arrangement gave them space. He was looking at his phone with an expression of intense, contained focus that she guessed had nothing to do with email. "You're making calls," she said. He glanced up. "I'm sending messages." "About Daniel." A pause. "About the situation." Emily looked out the window. The rain was beautiful from inside the car in a way it never was when you were standing in it. She pressed her fingers to the damp dish towel she was still holding against her face, felt the faint resistance of the cut. "I'm not a person who usually does this," she said. She wasn't sure exactly what she meant by this, whether she meant getting into cars with dangerous men, or needing help, or ending up on her kitchen floor, or all of it together. Adrian looked at her. The lights of the city were moving across his face in slow bars of gold and shadow. "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." "How could you tell?" "The chair," he said. She frowned. "What?" "The chair that was knocked over. It was positioned between you and the door. You put it there." He said it simply, without drama. "That's not someone who doesn't think. That's someone who thinks very quickly and ran out of good options before she could run out of bad ones." Emily stared at him. She didn't say anything for a moment, then, "It didn't work." "No," he said. "But you thought of it." He looked back at his phone. "That matters." The mansion, and there was no other word for it, whatever her mind tried to offer, was on the north side of the city, tucked behind iron gates and a perimeter of mature trees that screened it from the street with practiced efficiency. From the outside, it read as simply a large private residence. Inside, as Emily was walked through the front entrance by Reyes, with Adrian a half step behind, she understood that the word house was the way a person might describe the Atlantic as water, technically accurate and entirely beside the point. The entrance hall alone was the size of her entire apartment. Dark wood floors that caught the light from a chandelier that was tasteful rather than ostentatious, which somehow made it more impressive. A wide staircase curved upward to the right. Corridors branched to either side. And on the walls, not artwork chosen by a decorator, but photographs and objects arranged with the careful specificity of someone who actually lived with them. A framed map of a coastal city. A black and white photograph of a woman and two children. A set of 3 small paintings, landscapes, that were old enough to have darkened at the edges. A woman met them in the hallway. Mid-50s, small, with precise movements and gray-streaked hair pulled back from her face. She had the kind of expression that suggested she had been awake and ready at 11 at night because she was always awake and ready, and she looked at Emily with the same assessment the others had done, but with an added quality that was distinctly medical. "Lena," Reyes said. "I see her," Lena said, already moving toward Emily. "Let's get you sitting down, sweetheart." There was something in being called sweetheart, something about the ordinary warmth of it against the extraordinary strangeness of everything else, that hit Emily in an unguarded place. She went. Lena was not, Emily gathered, a hospital doctor. Or not only. She had the practiced, unhurried competence of someone who had done this work in conditions that did not permit the luxury of equipment or time, which perhaps explained her presence in the household of Adrian Valente. She checked Emily's ribs with careful hands and an expression of professional disapproval. Too cracked, she said, the rest badly bruised. Nothing that could be done except manage the pain and rest. The cut above her eyebrow was cleaned and closed with 4 butterfly strips. Her wrist was wrapped. You should eat something, Lena said, with the tone of someone offering a suggestion they knew would be declined. I'm not. You're in shock, Lena said pleasantly. And you haven't eaten since? She glanced at the clock on the wall. Probably lunch, based on your blood sugar. You should eat. Emily ate. A bowl of soup that appeared as if from nowhere. Something with root vegetables and herbs. Steam rising from it in the warm kitchen while Lena sat across from her and made notes in a small notebook without asking intrusive questions. It was, Emily thought, one of the stranger dinners of her life. Adrian came in while she was finishing. He had changed out of the charcoal suit. He was wearing a dark sweater now, simpler, and somehow more human-looking for it. He sat at the kitchen island without ceremony and poured himself a glass of water and looked at Lena. 2 cracked ribs, Lena told him. She'll be sore for 3 to 4 weeks. Nothing acute. Adrian looked at Emily. You'll stay here tonight, he said. You keep telling me what I'll do, Emily said. A silence. Then something happened at the corner of his mouth, like not quite a smile, something more compressed than that, something that might have been a smile in a different situation, with different parameters. You're right, he said. Would you stay here tonight? There's a guest room. Reyes is down the hall. Lena is here until morning. Emily looked at the soup bowl. At the butterfly strips on her face, she could feel faintly at the edge of her vision. At the kitchen of a man she'd met 2 hours ago, in a house she could never afford, through a wrong number. Yes, she said. Thank you. Adrian nodded. He drank his water. For a moment they sat in the warm kitchen while the rain continued outside, and Emily thought, this is the strangest night of my life, and also, I'm safe. And both of those things were true at the same time, and she didn't know what to do with either of them. The man who did this, Adrian said. He said it quietly, almost casually, looking at the glass in his hand. His name? Emily looked at him. Daniel Marsh, she said. Adrian didn't write it down. He didn't reach for a phone. He simply nodded, once, with the slight downward pressure of someone filing a piece of information into a place where it would not be forgotten. Okay, he said. The single word carried a weight that Emily felt somewhere in her sternum, distinct from the ache of her ribs. Outside, the rain kept falling on the city. Somewhere in that city, Daniel Marsh was sleeping without knowing that he had just become a name spoken inside these walls. And inside these walls, Emily Carter sat in a kitchen that wasn't hers and drank soup that she hadn't asked for and tried to understand how a wrong number sent from a cracked phone on a cold kitchen floor had landed her here. In the house of a man whose name people spoke quietly, whose empire ran on fear, whose dark eyes looked at her across a kitchen island like she was something worth protecting. She didn't understand it yet, but she was warm, and the door to this room was whole. The guest room was on the second floor, at the end of a corridor lined with the same dark hardwood as the rest of the house. The bed was large, covered in plain white linens, and clean in the way that suggested someone had prepared it recently, which meant Adrian had called ahead, which meant the text she'd sent from the kitchen floor had set something in motion she was only now beginning to glimpse the edges of. Reyes showed her to the door, stopped at the threshold. There's a lock on the inside, Reyes said. Not you can lock it if you want, just a statement of fact offered in the tone of someone who understood why the existence of a lock might matter. Thank you, Emily said. Reyes nodded. She started to turn away, then paused. For what it's worth, she said, and her voice was quieter now, with a different quality than the efficient professionalism she'd displayed all evening. He's not wrong about why he came tonight. She met Emily's eyes briefly. He doesn't explain himself, usually. I've worked with him for 6 years and I can tell you that. So if it seems strange, she shook her head slightly. It's not nothing, is all. She left before Emily could respond. Emily stood in the doorway of the guest room for a moment, then went in and closed the door behind her. She turned the lock. The room was still except for the rain. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at her cracked phone, which she'd carried here like a talisman. There were 3 missed calls from Vivian, who had apparently seen the message and panicked in the way good friends panic, and a string of texts that escalated from, "Hey, are you okay?" to Emily. "Answer your phone" to "I'm going to your apartment right now." Emily typed, "I'm okay. I'm somewhere safe. I'll explain tomorrow. Please don't go to the apartment tonight. Door is broken. Don't worry about me. I promise I'm okay." She stared at the words, "somewhere safe." Was that true? She thought about the lock on the inside of the door. She thought about Reyes's voice. He doesn't explain himself usually. She thought about Adrian Valente sitting in a kitchen drinking water and filing the name Daniel Marsh into a place where it would not be forgotten. She thought about being lifted, not literally, tonight, but in some way she didn't yet have language for. About having been seen on that floor and having someone arrive and say, "Without drama, I'm taking you somewhere safe," and meaning it. She didn't know who Adrian Valente was, not fully. She knew the shape of him, the way you know the shape of something large when you're standing too close to see it whole. She knew he was dangerous. She knew he had come. She turned off the light. She lay down on the bed, still in the clothes she'd been wearing all day, pulling the white duvet over herself. Outside the window, large, curtained, dark, the rain was softening now, losing its aggression, becoming something closer to ordinary weather. Her ribs ached. Her face ached. Her wrist ached. She was tired in a way that went below the muscles, below the adrenaline crash, down into somewhere fundamental. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 6 months, in a room with a locked door in a house that belonged to a stranger, Emily Carter fell asleep without listening for footsteps in the hallway. And that, perhaps, was the first change. The first small, impossible change that had started with a crack in a phone screen and a message sent to the wrong number on a cold, rainy Tuesday night in the city. She didn't know yet what it would become. None of us ever do, with the things that change everything. We only know them afterward, when we look back and see the thread, the single, fragile, accidental thread that was pulled the night it all began. She woke to light she didn't recognize. That was the first thing. The quality of it, the way it came through curtains she hadn't chosen in a room whose dimensions were wrong for any room she'd woken in before. Emily lay still for 3 full seconds before her memory assembled itself in the way memory does after a night of hard sleep. In pieces, each one arriving with a small weight until the whole picture was there. The door, the floor, the rain, the car, Adrian Valente's kitchen, the soup, the butterfly strips, the lock on the inside of the guest room door. She sat up carefully because her ribs issued an immediate, sharp reminder that they had opinions about sudden movement. She breathed through it, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way Lena had shown her before she slept. And when the worst of it passed, she looked around the room in the morning light. It was a good room. That was the honest assessment. Not grand in the aggressive way she might have expected from the entrance hall downstairs. No gilded mirrors, no obvious displays of expense for their own sake. Just a well-proportioned room with good light, solid furniture, a window that looked out over a garden she hadn't known was there, still winter bare but with the particular structured beauty of something that had been designed and tended. Her phone was on the nightstand. 7:41 in the morning. 6 missed calls from Vivian, which suggested that her text last night had not, in fact, resolved Vivian's concern so much as redirected it into a more focused form of alarm. Emily called her back. Vivian picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" Not hello, straight to it. "I'm okay," Emily said. "I'm somewhere safe, I promise." "Emily, I went to your apartment. Your door is—" Vivian's voice was tight and high with something that was trying not to become panic. "Your door is broken. There's It looked like it to you. I know. I know what it looks like. He came last night." A silence. Then, very quietly, "Oh, Em, I'm okay. I have cracked ribs and a cut on my face, but I'm okay. I'm really okay." She paused. "I need to tell you something strange." She told Vivian the abbreviated version, the version that skirted the parts she didn't have language for yet. Wrong number. A man came. His name. He brought me somewhere safe. She heard the silence on Vivian's end getting progressively more complicated as the information arrived. Adrian Valente, Vivian said when she finished. You've heard of him. Emily, everyone has heard of him. Vivian's voice had gone from frightened to something harder to characterize. He runs half the waterfront. The other half is afraid of him. I know. You know, and you got into his car. Vivian, my door was broken off its hinges. Another silence, longer this time. Then, are you sure you're safe? Emily looked at the locked door, at the window, at the garden below, where a man she didn't know was moving along the path between the bare hedges, hands in his coat pockets, in the unhurried way of someone doing a morning perimeter check, because that is the kind of thing that happens in this household. Yeah, she said. I think I am. She wasn't entirely sure that was the same as safe in any ordinary definition, but it was what she had, and this morning it was enough. She promised Vivian she would call by noon. She hung up, sat for a moment with the phone in her hands, and then, because there was nothing else to do and because staying in the room felt like a decision she hadn't made, she got up, moved carefully, and went to find the rest of the house. What she found, in the broad light of Wednesday morning, was that the mansion was not precisely what it had seemed at 11 o'clock at night. It was still large. It was still built on a scale that required adjustment, but it had the quality of a place that was actually lived in, which made it different from the cold grandeur she'd half expected. Books that had been read sat on shelves in the ways books only sit after they've been read. Slightly uneven, occasionally sideways, one here with a folded receipt bossed as a bookmark. There was a kitchen that smelled like coffee and something warm from the oven, and Lena was at the counter with a mug, reading something on a tablet, and she looked up when Emily appeared in the doorway and said, Sit, I'll get you something. You don't need to eat. You need to eat, Lena said, in the tone that suggested this was the only statement she intended to make on the subject. Emily sat. She ate scrambled eggs and toast and drank coffee that was better than anything she'd made in her own apartment in 4 months, and she watched the garden through the kitchen window and tried to locate herself in the situation she was in. She had been there 20 minutes when Adrian came in. He was dressed simply, dark trousers, a gray shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, which she filed as the casual version of the formidable man she'd met the night before. He looked rested in the controlled way of someone who doesn't sleep much but manages it efficiently, and he looked at her with that same direct, assessing quality that she was starting to understand was just how he looked at things. Not rudeness. Attention. How are your ribs? He said. Requesting a transfer, Emily said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth again, that compressed, almost smile. That's Lena's assessment, too. He poured coffee. He stood at the counter rather than sitting, which she was starting to understand was a default position for him, present but not settled, like someone who is always available to move. I spoke with Reyes this morning. About Daniel. About the situation. He looked at her over the coffee cup. He won't come back to your apartment. Emily set her fork down. What did you do? I had a conversation. You had a... She stopped, looked at him. Did you hurt him? No. The word came without hesitation, and something in its quietness made her believe it. He was given information about the quality of the decision he made last night, and about the consequences of making similar decisions in the future. He paused. He's a specific kind of coward, the kind that hurts people who seem unable to fight back. Give that kind of man a credible alternative, and they make different choices very quickly. Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked at the garden. She thought about Daniel straightening his jacket. You're sure? Yes. She didn't ask how. She wasn't sure she wanted to know how. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she believed him with a certainty that was either very good judgment or very poor judgment, and she found she couldn't entirely distinguish between the two this morning. Thank you, she said. Adrian nodded. He drank his coffee. He didn't perform any sentiment around the moment, didn't dress it up or ask for acknowledgement, and she found she appreciated that more than she'd expected to. He had done a thing. He had said what the thing was. He had moved on. I'd like you to stay a few days, he said. Emily looked at him. Your door needs to be repaired, he said, in the tone of someone offering a practical reason he is fully aware is not the only reason. It will take at least 48 hours. You shouldn't be alone in an apartment without a functional door. That's... She stopped, started again. That's a reason? Yes. Is it the whole reason? A pause. He looked at her with those very dark, very level eyes. You were on your kitchen floor last night, he said, with 2 cracked ribs and a split above your eye. No, it's not the whole reason. The honesty of that landed differently than she expected. She had been braced for something more evasive, more controlled. The directness of it opened a small question inside her that she didn't yet have the words to ask. All right, she said. All right, he said. And that was how Emily Carter came to stay in the house of Adrian Valente. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself it was practical. She told herself that the fact that she felt safer inside these walls than she had felt in her own apartment for 6 months was a comment on the past 6 months and not a comment on anything else. She was telling herself a lot of things in those early days. Some of them were even true. The days had a shape to them inside the mansion. Emily discovered this gradually, the way you discover the rhythms of any unfamiliar place, not all at once, but in small accumulated observations that eventually added up to understanding. Adrian rose early and worked from a home office on the ground floor that she hadn't yet been inside, and the sounds of the house in the early morning were the sounds of a place that operated with quiet intention. Low voices, phones handled in hushed tones, the occasional footstep moving with purpose down the corridor. By mid-morning, the pace changed. People came and went, Reyes most frequently, Marco sometimes, others she didn't know by name. Adrian's sister arrived on the 3rd day. Her name was Claudia, and she was 24 years old, and Emily was not prepared for this, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, nothing like Adrian. Where he was contained and economical, Claudia was luminous and unguarded, with a quality of openness that seemed almost impractical in the context of the household she'd grown up in. She was small and dark-haired with large eyes, and the kind of directness that was entirely different from Adrian's. His directness was calibrated, hers was simply a factory default. She walked into the kitchen on the 3rd morning, stopped, looked at Emily eating breakfast, and said, "You're the woman from the wrong number." Emily put down her mug. Word travels. "My brother called me," Claudia said. She sat down across the table without being asked, with the confidence of someone who has never been anywhere in this house that wasn't hers by birthright. "He doesn't call me unless something is worth calling about." She looked at Emily with frank, unself-conscious assessment. "He told me what happened. I'm sorry." "Thank you." "Is he being weird about it? He gets weird. He goes into..." Claudia made a gesture that seemed to mean something like management mode, all the humanity locked in a back room. "He does that when he doesn't know what to do with something." Emily looked toward the hallway. "He's been fine, actually. He's been kind." Claudia's eyes went wide in a way that was only slightly theatrical. "Kind. Is that surprising?" "No," Claudia said, and her voice shifted, losing the playful edge. "No, that's not surprising. He's..." She paused, looking at the table, moving her coffee mug half an inch to the left in an idle, thoughtful way. "He's different with people he decides matter. It's just that the list is very short." Emily looked at her. She was aware in the back of her mind of the thing that was happening inside her chest as these days accumulated, a warmth she hadn't asked for, a loosening of something she'd held tight for a long time. She was aware of it in the way you're aware of a warning light on a dashboard, visible, informative, not yet actionable. She did not add it to the list of things she was telling herself. That would come later. The conversation in the kitchen shifted. Claudia asked where Emily worked, and Emily told her. The logistics company near the South Waterfront, where she had been for 2 years, coordinating shipping schedules and port documentation with the quiet, systematic efficiency that she brought to things she was good at. Claudia listened with genuine interest, asked questions that were actually about the answers, and Emily found herself talking about the work in a way she hadn't in a long time, about the particular satisfaction of knowing which ships were where, of understanding the physical geography of the port and the rhythms of the cargo that moved through it. She didn't realize until she stopped talking that Claudia had gone slightly still. "You know the waterfront," Claudia said. 2 years of it. The South End. The cargo terminal there. Most of it. Emily frowned slightly. "Why?" Claudia looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing something careful and internal. No reason, she said. Just interesting. It was not, Emily would understand later, no reason. It was information being filed in a different kind of place, for reasons that would not become clear for some time. She didn't push it. She drank her coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was full of cold morning light, and somewhere in the house she could hear Adrian's voice, very low, in a conversation happening behind a closed door. She thought about what Claudia had said. The list is very short. She thought about being on that list, or possibly on that list, or the possibility of being on that list. And what she did with that thought was to put it away very carefully in a room she wasn't ready to open. She was good at that. She had been good at it for a long time. She was less good at it as the days continued. There were small things. There always are, with the things that get past the walls you build. Not the dramatic moments, not the speeches, but the accumulation of ordinary small things that don't announce themselves as important until you look back and understand how much ground they covered. The second evening, she had fallen asleep on the couch in the sitting room off the main hall with the book she'd taken from the shelf. A novel, something she'd been meaning to read for years. And when she woke an hour later, disoriented and stiff, there was a blanket over her that had not been there when she sat down, and the lamp beside her had been dimmed to its lowest setting. She didn't ask about it. She didn't need to. The fourth day, she tried to help with something in the kitchen and dropped a glass, and the crash of it brought her heart into her throat in a way she recognized as the hypervigilance of the past 8 months, the flinching at sudden sounds. She stood very still with the glass on the floor around her, breathing. Adrian appeared in the doorway a moment later, not rushing, not alarmed, just present in the way he was present. He looked at her, not the glass. "Breathe," he said. "I'm breathing." "You're not," he said. He said it without judgment. "Breathe." She breathed. He waited until she had, then picked up the largest pieces of glass without commentary, found a broom without asking where it was, swept the rest, left without saying anything more. She looked at the floor where the glass had been, now clean, and felt something move in her chest that she put away immediately in the room with the other things. On the 5th day, she found him in the garden. It was late afternoon, the light going gray and low, the kind of afternoon that compresses everything down to texture and quiet. She had come out for air. Lena had said air was good for healing, which was possibly medical and possibly just Lena's way of making sure Emily moved. And she had come around the side of the house along the path and found Adrian standing at the far end of the garden near the garden wall, not pacing, not on his phone, just standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his face tilted slightly upward in the direction of the low sky. She almost turned back. Something stopped her. She wasn't entirely sure what. She walked down the path and stopped a few feet away, and he didn't react to her arrival in the way people react to being interrupted. No shift of posture, no putting away of expression. He just looked at her as she came alongside him, and they stood together in the gray light for a moment without speaking. "This is where you come when you need to be outside without being available," she said. A pause. "Yes." "How often is that?" "More than I'd like," he said. And something in the way he said it, not complaint, not performance of depth, just the plain fact of it, opened a door she hadn't expected to find in this conversation. "What is it that makes you need to come out here?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. The garden was quiet around them. Somewhere past the wall, the city moved with its ordinary intentions. "I run things," he said. "Large things, complex things. And the running of them requires a particular mode, a way of operating." He paused. "Out here I can stop operating. And you can't do that inside? Not when there are people inside who need things from me." "I need things from you," Emily said. "I know," he said. "You're different." She looked at him. "You don't need anything I have to perform," he said. He was looking at the garden wall, not at her. "The power, the decisions, He shook his head slightly. "You needed somewhere to sleep without listening for footsteps. You needed your ribs to heal. You needed soup." He said it without drama, like a list of verifiable facts. "Those are real things. The other..." He gestured with one hand, a compressed, sideways gesture at the general direction of the house and everything it implied. "A lot of that is theater. Out here, there's no theater." Emily was quiet for a moment. You don't seem like someone who needs to explain himself, she said. I don't, usually. Then why are you? He finally looked at her. The gray light was even on his face, and without the interior light in the context of the house, he looked not different exactly, but like a different layer of the same person. More complicated. More tired. I don't know, he said, and she believed that too. They stood in the garden until the light was fully gone, not talking much, not needing to. When they went back inside, it was to the smell of whatever Lena had made for dinner and the sound of Claudia's voice from the kitchen, bright and ordinary, and the warmth of the house closing around them. Emily thought about the garden wall. She thought about standing on one side of something and having it shift while you weren't paying attention. She had been there a week when she first heard the name Victor Morano. She heard it the way you hear things in a house like that, obliquely, through proximity, through the unguarded moment in a conversation where a name appears with weight attached to it. She was coming down the corridor from the direction of the sitting room when she heard Reyes's voice from behind the door of Adrian's office, and the door was not entirely closed, and she heard Reyes say, Morano's people were at the South Dock again last night. She heard Adrian say, watching or testing? Reyes said, too early to say, but the frequency is increasing. A silence that had texture to it. Then Adrian, all right, double the rotation at the waterfront. Don't draw it obvious. Emily kept walking. She went to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window and looked at the winter garden and turned the name over in her mind. Morano, South Dock. Frequency increasing. She knew the South Dock. She knew it well. The layout of it, the timing of the cargo rotations, the blind spots in the lighting that happened after 9 when the Northern Platform crew ended their shift. She had been writing shipping documentation for that terminal for 2 years. She knew which gates had cameras and which ones had cameras that the maintenance crew kept putting in requests to replace. She put the glass down on the counter. She did not think about why this information had arranged itself quietly and without announcement in the front of her mind. She told herself it was just professional reflex, the habit of a person who had spent 2 years knowing where everything was. She was telling herself a lot of things. The dinner that evening was the first time they had all sat at the table together. Adrian, Claudia, Emily, Reyes, even Marco, who turned out to speak very little, but to listen with an attentiveness that she suspected retained everything. Lena had made something elaborate and Italian and almost aggressively good, and Claudia had opened a bottle of wine and launched into a story about a misadventure with a taxi driver and a misread address that had the table laughing before the soup course was finished. Emily laughed. She realized partway through laughing that it was the first time she had laughed. Genuinely, body involved, surprised by it laughed. In weeks, possibly months. She looked up from the laughing and found Adrian watching her across the table with an expression that was not quite readable, but that contained something unguarded in it, something that appeared and was recognized, and then was carefully set aside by both of them simultaneously, with the mutual, unspoken agreement of two people who are not yet prepared to name the thing they are looking at. Claudia refilled her wine glass without being asked. After dinner, when the table was clearing and Claudia had commandeered Marco into a debate about something Emily hadn't quite followed, Adrian stopped beside her in the doorway to the kitchen with the particular quality of someone who has something to say and is choosing whether to say it. "You're different than you were a week ago," he said. Emily considered that. "Is that good?" "I don't know yet," he said. "You seemed like glass before, like something held together under pressure." He looked at her. "You're still held together, but it looks more like a choice now." She thought about the garden, about the room she'd been storing things in, about how the door of it was becoming slightly less easy to keep closed. "You see a lot," she said. "Occupational habit," he said. "Of which occupation?" The almost smile appeared. He went into the kitchen without answering. Emily stood in the doorway for a moment. Outside, it was raining again. Lighter now. A steady, soft rain without last week's aggression, the kind that doesn't threaten, just persists. She thought about the name Morano, about the South Dock and the cameras that needed replacing, about the way information sits in the body, ready. She thought about what Claudia had said. The list is very short. She thought about Adrian standing in the garden looking at the sky. She went to the sitting room, picked up the book she'd been reading from the couch, and sat in the chair by the lamp he'd dimmed for her. She read 3 pages without retaining a single word. Because what was happening? And she could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, not in a single moment, but in the pressure of the air, the shift of the light. What was happening was that the world she had walked into on the night of a wrong number was expanding around her, becoming three-dimensional, becoming something with weight and history and heat in it. And at the center of it was a man she had not chosen to meet, in a house she had not chosen to enter, who had come to her kitchen floor with 3 knocks on a broken door and a quiet voice that said, "I'm coming," and had meant it in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was still telling herself things, sensible things, protective things. The internal architecture of a woman who had learned in 14 months in the kitchen floor of her apartment that feeling safe and being safe were not always the same. But the distance between what she was telling herself and what she was actually feeling was closing. She was aware of that. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the rain outside, and the warmth of the lamp, and the sounds of the house settling around her. The low voices, the footsteps, the particular quality of a place where people are present and keeping watch. Safe, she thought. And then she thought, dangerous. And she sat with both of those things being true at the same time, which was the most honest thing she had managed all week. Somewhere on the other side of the city, on the south dock where the cameras needed replacing, a car had been parked for 6 consecutive evenings in the shadow of the northern platform. The man inside it had a phone and a set of photographs and a file with a name on the front, and the name on the front of the file was not his own. Victor Morano did not come to a thing directly. That was not how he operated. He came to things the way a tide comes to a shore, gradually, persistently, and with the patient certainty of something that knows it has time on its side. He had been watching the Valente operation for a long time. He knew the waterfront rotations, he knew the logistics, he knew the gaps in coverage, the timing of shifts, the geometry of the territory. What he had not known, until 6 days ago, was that something new had moved into the center of Adrian Valente's world. A woman, a logistics coordinator from the South Terminal Shipping Office. No history with the organization, no apparent connection. An accident by all appearances, which was, in Morano's experience, exactly the kind of thing that wasn't. He looked at the photograph in his file for a long moment. Then he put it away and looked at the dark water of the harbor, and he thought about what leverage looked like and where it usually lived. Not in the strong things, never in the strong things, in the new things, the soft things, the things a powerful man had not yet had time to protect. He started the car. He had time. He would be patient. He always was. The second week began the way the first had ended, quietly, with the rain gone and a cold, clear sky pressing down over the city like a held breath. Emily's ribs were healing. Lena confirmed this on the 9th morning with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose work was proceeding on schedule, pressing 2 fingers along Emily's left side and declaring the inflammation reduced, the worst of the bruising entering its yellow-green phase, which was ugly but represented progress. Emily could breathe through a full count now without negotiating with the pain. She could move without holding herself like something breakable. She had gone back to her apartment twice, both times with Reyes, both times briefly. The door had been repaired, a new deadbolt installed, the hinge replaced with hardware that looked considerably more serious than the original. On the first visit, she had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the floor and the repaired cabinets and the counter where the mug with the bluebirds had been, and she had made herself stand there until it was just a kitchen again. Just her kitchen, with its thin walls and its unreliable radiator and its window that looked out over the street she'd chosen because it was affordable and walking distance from the bus line. On the second visit, she had packed a bag. She told herself it was because Lena said another week of recovery would make a meaningful difference. She told herself it was because her apartment was cold and the radiator was still unreliable. She told herself it was practical. She was running low on things to tell herself. What she knew, with a clarity she was no longer fighting. She slept better in the guest room with the lock on the inside of the door than she had slept in her own apartment in 6 months. She ate better. She moved through this day with less of the flinching, self-monitoring hypervigilance that had become so constant she'd stopped recognizing it as abnormal. The wound was healing, not just the ribs. And the person most responsible for that environment, who had created it not by drama or declaration, but by the steady, uncomplicated fact of his presence, was a man whose life she was still working to understand. She understood more of it now. in pieces, through observation, through the small fragments that Claudia offered with her characteristic unguarded openness, through the occasional window of conversation that Adrian opened and then closed with the precision of someone who has spent a long time managing what he shows. She knew that the empire, the word felt too theatrical, but she didn't have a better one, had come to him not through desire but through sequence. His father had built it, a first-generation immigrant with no tolerance for the pace of legitimate industry, who had discovered that the city had seams in it, gaps between what was legal and what was wanted, and who had moved into those gaps with intelligence and a particular kind of ruthlessness that came from having nothing to lose. He had built something substantial. And then he had died when Adrian was 22 and Claudia was 13, and Adrian had inherited not a choice but a fact. This was what Claudia told her on an afternoon when they were sitting in the upstairs sitting room and the light was doing something warm and angular through the tall windows. Claudia told it simply, without the editorial architecture that people often build around painful history, and Emily listened in the same way. He never wanted it, Claudia said. She was looking at the window, not at Emily. That's the thing people don't understand when they hear his name. They think that it's something he chose. He was 22. He had me to take care of. And everything our father had built was already in motion and there was no... She shook her head. There was no neutral option. You either take the wheel or you get run over by it. Emily thought about that. He could have walked away. Could he? Claudia looked at her. With me at 13 and a dozen people who'd worked for my father since before we were born? With the debts and the alliances and the people who were going to come looking regardless of what Adrian decided? She paused. People say you can always walk away. I've never found it to be quite as simple as that. Emily thought about her own 14 months, about the checklist articles at 2 a.m, about how long it had taken her to understand that she was in something and how much longer it had taken her to leave, and how leaving had not, in the end, been the ending. No, she said quietly, it's not simple. Claudia looked at her with the directness she carried everywhere. He's been trying to simplify it for years, legitimize the businesses, move things into the light. It's slow, and it's complicated, and there are people who have a significant interest in the status quo. She paused. People like Murano. The name arrived in the conversation the way Emily had been half expecting it to. Inevitably, the way things arrive when you've been aware of them building at the edge of the room. Tell me about Murano, Emily said. Claudia's expression shifted. Not fear exactly, something more like the specific wariness of someone who has grown up knowing that certain names carry operational weight. Victor Murano runs the Eastern Corridor, Claudia said. Ports, distribution, the casino interests on the east side. He and my father had an arrangement. Territories, non-interference, the usual architecture. She said the usual architecture with a slight flatness that suggested she'd grown up hearing that phrase applied to things that other people's sisters did not have to understand. When my father died, Murano decided the arrangement was worth renegotiating. And Adrian disagreed. Adrian is still here, Claudia said. Murano is still trying. She paused. The difference between them is that Murano has always understood the territory as a resource, something to be extracted. Adrian. She tilted her head slightly. Adrian understands it as a responsibility. The people in it. That's a different kind of motivation. Emily looked at the window. The cold afternoon light was doing its slow work across the floor. Is he dangerous? She said. Murano. Claudia was quiet for a moment. He's patient, she said. Which is more dangerous. Emily thought about the car parked outside the dock 6 evenings in a row. She thought about Reyes's voice through the not-quite-closed door. The frequency is increasing. She thought about her 2 years of South Terminal documentation, sitting in the front of her mind like a set of tools left out on a workbench. She didn't say anything about it then. She would say something about it soon enough, but not then. The moment that changed everything came 11 days into her stay, on a Tuesday evening when the house had the particular charged quality of a place where something is being managed very carefully by people who are very good at managing things. Emily had noticed it building since midday. The quality of the footsteps in the corridor, the lowered voices, the way Reyes had walked through the kitchen twice in the span of an hour, with her phone in her hand and the expression of someone reading information they had not wanted to receive. She had not asked. She had learned in 11 days the grammar of this household, and she understood that there were conversations she was not part of and questions that were not hers to ask until someone decided they were. She was in the sitting room when she heard it. Adrian's voice from behind the closed door of his office, and the quality of it was different from anything she'd heard before. Not raised, he did not appear to be someone who raised his voice as a first option. But underneath the controlled surface of it, there was something that was trying to break through, something she could feel from the other side of a closed door, the way you feel a temperature change before you understand its cause. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand up. She went to the office door, stopped, knocked twice. A silence. Then, "Not now, Emily." She knew, from the way he said it, Emily, her name, which he used rarely and with a precise quality that made her aware of its weight, that whatever was behind that door was significant. She opened it anyway. Adrian was standing at his desk with his back to the door, one hand pressed flat on the surface and the other holding his phone, and Reyes was standing across from him with the expression of someone delivering information they wished they did not have to deliver. And Marco was at the window, which he only ever did when the situation required him to be positioned between something and the outside world. Adrian turned. His face was a controlled thing. She had learned to read the control, learned when it was equilibrium and when it was effort. This was effort. This was the face of a man holding something very large and very heavy and distributing the weight across every available surface because the alternative was unacceptable. "I said not now." "I heard you," Emily said. She looked at Reyes. "What happened?" Reyes looked at Adrian, a fractional thing, a question asked and answered in the time it took to shift a gaze. Adrian said nothing for a moment. Then he set the phone down on the desk with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of violence, and he said, "Claudia didn't come home." The words hit Emily like a physical thing. She had seen Claudia at breakfast, 8 hours ago. Claudia, who had a standing dinner arrangement with a friend across town on Tuesdays, who had texted at 6 saying she was on her way home, who had not arrived. "How long?" Emily said. "Her last message was at 6:12, Reyes said. "It's 9:40. Marco drove the route. The friend confirmed she left at 5:50. 3 hours and 48 minutes. A woman who texted with the frequency and reliability of someone who'd grown up understanding that being findable was a form of safety, gone from a known route in under 4 hours. Emily looked at Adrian. He was looking at the desk. The muscle along his jaw was doing something that made her understand, for the first time in the full-body way that understanding works. What it looked like when a man who ran an empire on controlled violence was confronted with the possibility that the violence had arrived at the thing he protected most. "Morano," Emily said. It was not a question. Adrian raised his eyes to her. "It's the escalation," she said. "You said the frequency was increasing. This is what increasing was building to." A silence in the room. Reyes was watching her. Marco had turned from the window. "We don't know that," Reyes said, with the careful professionalism of someone who knows exactly what they know and exactly what they don't. "Then what else?" Emily said. Another silence. "Reyes," Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. "Start with the waterfront contacts. Cross-reference the Eastern Corridor holdings." He looked at Emily for a moment, and something in the look was complicated in a way she couldn't fully parse. Some combination of the controlled fury he was managing and something else. Something that had to do with her being in this room, with her having opened the door he'd told her not to open. "Go." Reyes went. Marco followed. The door closed behind them. Adrian stood at his desk. Emily stood at the door she'd opened. They looked at each other across 12 feet of office that suddenly felt like a different kind of space than any room she'd been in with him before. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. "Claudia is missing," Emily said. "I know that." "Then you know that right now whatever you're protecting me from by keeping me out of this room is less important than finding her." She held his gaze. "I know the South Terminal. I know the Eastern Corridor docks better than any logistics company in the city. I've been in every loading facility, every transfer point, every blind spot in the security grid between the main port and the end of Morano's territory." She paused. If he took her somewhere to hold her, It's somewhere controlled, somewhere with access management, somewhere the geography matters. I know that geography. Adrian was very still. You're not one of my people, he said. It was not a rejection. It was a statement being made while he looked at her and evaluated something. I know that too, Emily said, but Claudia spent the afternoon telling me about your father and about Murano and about the difference between understanding territory as a resource and understanding it as a responsibility. She paused. So let me be responsible for this part, the part I actually know. The room was very quiet. Adrian looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat. He opened his laptop and turned it toward her. "Show me what you know," he said. She showed him. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of Emily pulling from 2 years of accumulated knowledge, mapping the terminal layout against what she knew of Murano's operational patterns, identifying the facilities with the right combination of controlled access, isolation from regular port traffic, and loading infrastructure that could manage movement of people as well as cargo. She talked through it with the focused precision that was its own muscle memory, and Adrian listened with the quality of attention that had become familiar to her, and 2/3 of the way through she said, almost to herself, "The consolidation facility at Pier 17. She stopped. "What is it?" Adrian said. "Pier 17 has been under a maintenance shutdown for 3 weeks, she said slowly. Officially. But the shutdown filing was submitted through one of Murano's shell logistics companies. She looked up at Adrian. I processed the documentation. I thought it was routine. Maintenance shutdowns happen. She paused. But a legitimate maintenance shutdown doesn't need to route through a third-party logistics filing. It goes directly through Port Authority. Adrian was very still. If the facility is officially closed, Emily said, the security rotation reverts to the minimum overnight crew. 2 people. East entrance is the only staffed gate. The west loading doors open on a hydraulic system that maintenance resets to manual operation during a shutdown. She looked at him. It's isolated, it's controlled. It has vehicle access from 3 directions, and as far as anyone's records show, it's empty. Adrian was already on his phone. Reyes, he said, Pier 17, get everyone. What followed was the most concentrated and disorienting 2 hours of Emily's life, and she had recently spent 2 hours on her kitchen floor, which she would have thought had set a difficult standard to surpass. She was told, very clearly, that she was staying at the house. Adrian said it in the tone that was not a suggestion, and Reyes said it in the tone that was a professional assessment of operational liability, and Marco simply stood at the door of the sitting room with the quiet permanence of a closed door that has opinions. She understood why. She even, on some level, accepted why. She had given them what she had, the geography, the access, the window and the coverage. She had done the thing she could do. She sat in the sitting room. She sat for approximately 25 minutes, which was long enough for Marco to have decided she had accepted the arrangement and to have gone to the kitchen for coffee, and then she did the thing she had not told anyone she was going to do. She went. Not recklessly. She was not built for reckless. She went with a clear assessment of what she knew and what she could do with it. She took her coat, she took the transit pass she always carried. She took the specific knowledge that there was a secondary access point to the Pier 17 facility that the Port Authority documentation listed as emergency egress, and that most people in logistics knew about, and most people in security planning forgot about, because it appeared on a secondary filing from 4 years ago that predated the current facility management. She knew about it because it was her job to know about things like that. She came out of the north side of the facility compound 18 minutes later from a street-level access that was not the main gate and not the east entrance, and not anywhere that the men covering the perimeter would have anticipated. And she moved along the outer wall of the facility in the dark and the cold with her heart doing something she could hear in her own ears. And she had a very clear and simple objective. The detonator. What she had understood in the sitting room was something she had not said out loud during the 40 minutes of maps and logistics because it had come to her afterward, assembled from pieces she'd been holding separately. Murano's maintenance shutdown had included a structural modification filing. She'd processed that too 3 weeks ago, thought nothing of it. Pier 17. Electrical infrastructure update. Load-bearing assessment. Electrical infrastructure and load-bearing assessment were the paperwork that preceded the installation of charges. The facility could be rigged, and if Morano's plan was to create an ending rather than a hostage situation, the detonator would be accessible from outside the main confrontation, from the secondary mechanical room on the north wall, which was the only part of the facility not visible from the central floor where any armed confrontation would occur. She reached the secondary mechanical room door. It was locked with a standard industrial padlock of the type used throughout the port facilities, the type she carried a master key for in her work bag, because it was issued to all logistics coordinators for emergency access purposes. And she had her work bag because she had packed it at her apartment on the second visit and had not unpacked it since. The key turned. She went in. The mechanical room smelled of concrete dust and machine oil, and something chemical underneath that she identified and did not allow herself to think about too carefully. There was a bank of electrical panels on the far wall, and below them a control box that was not original to the facility. It was newer, cleaner, attached to the panel with the specific tidiness of something recently installed by someone who knew what they were doing. She could hear the firefight now. It was not loud in the cinematic way. The sounds from the main floor of the facility, separated from her by two walls and a corridor, were compressed and intermittent, but they were unmistakable. She moved to the control box. She looked at it. She was not an explosives technician. She was a logistics coordinator with a master key and 2 years of port documentation and the particular clarity of mind that arrives sometimes in extreme situations when everything non-essential falls away and what remains is just the thing in front of you and what you know about it. What she knew was this. The control box had a primary trigger, a keyed switch, which would require something she didn't have. And it had a secondary safety override, which was required by Port Authority regulations for any electrical installation in a facility that handled cargo, and which was a manual circuit interrupt, which was a red-handled switch inside a locked transparent cover, and the lock on the transparent cover was the same standard industrial lock as the door. She used the master key. She opened the cover. She pulled the switch. The box went dark. She stood in the mechanical room in the sudden quiet of a system that was no longer active. And she breathed, and she listened to the sounds from the main floor, and she waited. What she heard eventually, slowly, then all at once, the way the end of things sounds, was the change in the quality of the noise. Less, then voices, one of which she recognized. She went back through the corridor. She came out onto the main floor of Pier 17 from the north access door. The warehouse was large, cold, lit by the portable work lights that Adrian's people had brought and positioned with tactical efficiency. The floor was vast and concrete and scattered with the aftermath of what had happened. Overturned equipment, spent casings, the specific disorder of a space where forces had moved against each other. At the far end, near the eastern loading dock, there was a group of people she didn't know. Morano's men, from the look of them, now stationary in the specific way that men become stationary when the situation has resolved against them. And in the center of the floor, there was Claudia. She was on her feet. That was the first thing Emily registered. She was standing, she was upright, she had a cut on her face, and her coat was torn, but she was on her feet and her eyes were open, and she was looking at her brother, who was approximately 4 feet away from her and bleeding from his left arm, and looking at her with an expression that Emily would not have known how to describe except to say it was everything the controlled surface of him had been sitting on top of for 11 days. He reached out and took Claudia's face in both his hands. He said something very low, inaudible from where Emily stood, something that was only for his sister. Claudia's eyes filled. "I know," Claudia said, audible even across the floor. "I know, I'm okay. I'm okay, Adrian." Emily stood at the north access door and watched the two of them and felt something move through her that was not anything she had words for. Then Reyes appeared at her elbow. "You were supposed to stay at the house," Reyes said. "Yes," Emily agreed. "You pulled the secondary override." "Yes." A pause. "How did you know about the secondary override?" "Emergency egress filing 4 years ago," Emily said. "Port Authority Regulation 712, required on all electrical installations in cargo-rated facilities." She paused. "It's in the documentation." Reyes looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. Professional reassessment, something resembling respect, and something else that might have been the beginning of a different kind of regard. "He's going to be angry," Reyes said. "I know," Emily said. "Are you prepared for that?" Emily looked across the floor to where Adrian was still standing with his sister, and where he was now, apparently sensing something in the room, raising his eyes to find her standing at the north door with Reyes. His eyes met hers across the warehouse floor. The expression on his face was the most complicated thing she had ever tried to read. Fury was in it. She could see that. The controlled, banked fury of a man who had told her to stay and had been disobeyed in a situation where disobedience carried mortal risk. And underneath the fury, or alongside it, or threaded through it in ways she could not separate cleanly, something else. Something that had to do with the north door and the detonator, and what it meant that she had come. She held his gaze. She didn't look away. He started walking toward her across the warehouse floor, and she could see that his left arm was bleeding significantly, and that he was favoring it, and that he was not going to address any of that before he addressed her, because that was who he was. He reached her. He stopped. He was close. Closer than he'd stood before, not touching, but close enough that she could see the precise quality of the thing happening in his eyes. "I told you to stay," he said. "You did," she said. "You could have been killed." "So could Claudia." A silence. "That's not the point," he said, and his voice had something raw in it now, something that was not entirely the controlled instrument she'd come to know. "It's exactly the point," Emily said. "The facility was rigged, Adrian. Murano had charges in the electrical infrastructure. I processed the installation filing 3 weeks ago. Structural modification, electrical infrastructure, load-bearing assessment. I understood what that meant when I was sitting in your sitting room and I made a decision." She met his eyes. "If I'd stayed, and if the override had been triggered while you were on that floor, there would have been nothing left to argue about." The warehouse was very quiet around them. "You pulled a circuit interrupt in a facility that was potentially rigged," Adrian said, without knowing the exact configuration of the installation, without knowing whether the interrupt was isolated or whether it was part of a chain, without knowing. "I know Port Authority Regulation 712, Emily said. "I know how those boxes are built. I know that a secondary override in a cargo facility has to be circuit isolated by code because of the cargo handling equipment. I wasn't guessing. I was using what I know." She paused. "That's what you asked me to do. In the office. You asked me to show you what I know." The raw thing in his voice was different now from what it had been a moment ago. She could feel the shift in it without being entirely sure she could name it. "You're bleeding," she said. He looked at his arm as though he'd forgotten about it, which she suspected was accurate. "Reyes," he said, without looking away from Emily. "Already on it," Reyes said from somewhere behind her. They stood there for a moment on the concrete floor of Pier 17 in the aftermath of everything, with the portable work lights casting long shadows, and Claudia somewhere behind them, and the city going about its ordinary business on the other side of the facility walls. And Emily looked at Adrian Valente, and Adrian Valente looked at Emily Carter, and the distance between what they weren't saying and what they both knew was thinner than it had ever been. "You scared me," he said. The 3 words arrived with such quiet specificity, so different from anything she'd expected from him, that she felt them in her chest with an acuity that had nothing to do with her ribs. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "No, you're not," he said. A pause. "No," she admitted. "Not entirely." Something moved across his face, that compressed thing that in another life, and with different parameters, would simply have been called a smile. Then Lena was there, appearing from the direction of the loading dock with her kit, and the professional displeasure of someone whose patients kept doing things she'd asked them not to do. And she took Adrian's arm with the authority of a woman who did not observe a hierarchy when someone was bleeding, and she began working. Emily stepped back. She found Claudia standing a few feet away, wrapped in someone's jacket, with the cut on her face that was going to need attention, and the eyes of someone who had been frightened and was processing the aftermath of it. Claudia looked at Emily, and Emily looked at Claudia, and then Claudia reached out and put her arms around Emily without saying anything, and Emily, who had not been held in a long time, not since before 14 months that had taught her to be careful about arms, let her. They stood there in the warehouse. Outside, the city kept moving in its ordinary way, indifferent and continuous. And inside Pier 17, something had shifted that would not shift back. Victor Murano was alive. He was in a room at the east end of the facility with 2 of Adrian's people standing outside the door, And he was going to be a problem, a legal problem, a territorial problem, the complex and dangerous kind of problem that does not resolve itself in a single evening, no matter how definitively one side has won the night. Emily understood that. She understood that the evening had been a battle and not the war, and that the kind of patient, title man that Claudia had described did not stop being patient or title because of a single loss. She understood all of that, but she also understood that Claudia was alive, that Adrian was bleeding from his arm and not from anywhere worse, that the facility had not detonated, and that 3 words had been spoken on a concrete floor that she was going to have to put somewhere, into the room she'd been filling, or somewhere else, somewhere that required a different kind of door entirely. "You scared me." She held Claudia's shoulder. She looked at the north door she'd come through. She thought about the master key in her bag and the red-handled switch, and the regulation she'd filed away 2 years ago for a reason she couldn't have predicted. And she thought about how sometimes the things you carry without knowing why are exactly the things that matter at the only moment it counts. And outside, the city breathed, and inside, so did she. The days after Pier 17 had a different texture than the days before it. It was not that the house changed. The dark hardwood floors were the same. The garden was the same. Lena moved through the kitchen with the same efficient authority. Marco maintained the same quiet permanence at the perimeter. The structure of the place was intact, but something had shifted inside the structure, the way a house shifts after a storm. Not damaged, not broken, but subtly resettled on its foundation, everything in the same position but resting differently than it had before. Claudia healed quickly, which was entirely in character. The cut on her face was closed by Lena within an hour of returning from the facility, and by the following morning she was in the kitchen with coffee and the practical determination of someone who had decided that the most useful response to having been frightened was to refuse to stay frightened. She talked about what had happened with a directness that Emily recognized as its own form of processing, naming the thing, turning it over in the light, refusing to let it become larger than it was by keeping it in the dark. "He kept saying it was business," Claudia told her on the second morning, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around her mug. Murano. He kept using that word, business, like that was supposed to make it smaller. She looked at the window. "I think he expected me to cry, to ask him what he wanted, to perform being afraid in the way that makes men feel they have leverage." She paused. "I was afraid, but I wasn't going to perform it for him." Emily looked at her. She thought about what it took to hold yourself like that in a situation like that. "What did you do?" "I talked to his people," Claudia said. "Not to him. To the men he'd put in the room with me. I asked them their names. I asked one of them about the scar on his hand." She smiled slightly, something wry and tired in it. "They didn't know what to do with that. You'd be surprised how disorienting ordinary questions become in an extraordinary situation." Emily thought about that for a moment. "That's not something you learn," she said. "That's something you already are." Claudia looked at her. Something warm and complicated moved through her eyes. "The same could be said for what you did," she said. "The north door, the mechanical room. People who are afraid of themselves don't do things like that." Emily looked at her coffee. "I was terrified," she said. "Of course you were," Claudia said. "That's different from being afraid of yourself." It was one of those exchanges that Emily found herself turning over afterward, in the quiet of the guest room or the sitting room, holding it up to different angles of light. She thought about what it meant to be afraid of something and do it anyway, not out of bravado, not out of the performed courage that looked good from outside, but out of the particular, clear-eyed decision that the thing in front of you mattered more than your own comfort. She had been making those decisions for years, quietly, without naming them. The decision to leave Daniel. The 14 months before she made it, the slow accumulation of understanding that had eventually become undeniable. The cracked phone on the cold floor, reaching for help with hands that were shaking. She had been afraid every time. And she had done the thing anyway. She was doing it now, or beginning to. The thing with Adrian did not announce itself. It did not arrive in the form of a conversation with a clear structure, a declared moment with clean edges. It arrived the way most true things arrived, gradually, and then all at once. And the all-at-once part was preceded by so much gradual that by the time it happened you had already known it for a long time. His arm healed on the same schedule as her ribs, and Lena supervised both recoveries with the even-handed efficiency of someone running a convalescence ward that happened to be located inside a crime empire. Emily had found herself, in those early days after the warehouse, sitting in the kitchen or the sitting room with Adrian in the way that two people sit in the same space when neither of them has decided to be there, but neither of them has decided to leave. Not performing proximity, just occupying the same room, which had become comfortable in a way that took her by surprise when she noticed it. They talked. That was the thing she had not expected. Not the conversations that were about the situation, the operational discussions that she was sometimes included in now as a matter of practical geography, her knowledge of the port and the terminal documented and referenced by Reyes with professional thoroughness. Those conversations made sense. They had a logic. But the other kind, the kind that happened in the evenings in the kitchen or in the garden on the days when the cold was dry enough to be bearable, the kind that wandered from one thing to another without apparent destination. Those were the conversations she had not anticipated, and they were the ones that were changing everything. She learned that he read history, not as background or context, but with the absorbed attention of someone who found in it the patterns that explained the present. He had shelves of it in the office she had now been inside many times. And when she asked about one particular book, a dense text on the collapse of certain city-states, he had talked about it for 20 minutes with the unguarded enthusiasm of a man who had forgotten, temporarily, to manage his presentation. She learned that he had taught himself to cook during the years after his father died. Not because anyone expected it of him, but because it was a thing he could do alone in a kitchen at midnight that produced a concrete result and required his complete attention and gave him an hour in which he was not required to manage anything. She found this out because she came into the kitchen at 11:30 on a Wednesday, and he was making something complicated with garlic and wine and the practiced focus of someone in a private ritual, and he glanced up and said with no particular self-consciousness, "Sit down, it'll be 20 minutes." And she sat down and they ate at midnight at the kitchen island and talked about nothing important, which turned out to be its own kind of important. She learned that he went to the garden not just when he needed to stop operating, but when something had happened that he was required to feel and had not yet found the mechanism for. She learned this because she began to know from certain qualities of the house in certain moments when he was there, and twice she went out and found him and stayed. And both times they stood in the cold and talked about things that had nothing to do with what he was actually processing, and she understood that this was its own form of company, being with someone without requiring them to explain themselves, and that it seemed to be a form he needed. What she was doing, she understood, was seeing him. And he was letting her. That was the most unexpected part. Not that she cared for him. She could trace that. She could map the accumulation of it, could identify the moments and their weights, but that he was allowing himself to be seen by her. For a man who operated on control and managed surfaces and had, by Claudia's account, spent the better part of a decade being known only by his function rather than his interior, the allowance was significant. She didn't rush it. She recognized it, and she waited, the way you wait for something fragile to stabilize. The conversation came on a Thursday evening, 22 days after the warehouse. They were in the sitting room. The lamp was on, the one he'd dimmed for her, what felt like a long time ago now. She had her book. He had a file he wasn't reading. The fire in the fireplace was doing its steady work. Outside, the city was making its late-night sounds, muted through the glass, existing at a remove that felt less like isolation and more like a considered distance from things that were too loud. She had been thinking for several days about leaving, not because she wanted to. That was the precise problem. She did not want to, and the not wanting was something she needed to examine rather than simply inhabit. Her door had been fixed for weeks. Her ribs were healed. She had returned to work 3 days ago, remote access first and then in person, back to the terminal documentation and the shipping schedules and the particular satisfaction of knowing exactly where things were. She had a life. It existed outside these walls. Vivian had texted 6 times asking when she was coming back to it. She was choosing to be here. She needed to understand what she was choosing. "I've been thinking about going home," she said. Adrian looked up from the file he wasn't reading. The shift was small, the way he stilled just slightly, the way a room stills when the temperature changes. "When?" he said. "I don't know yet." She looked at the fire. "That's the honest answer." I've been trying to figure out whether not knowing is wisdom or avoidance. He was quiet for a moment. He set the file on the cushion beside him and looked at her with the full, undivided quality of his attention, which she had learned to receive without flinching. "What's keeping you from knowing?" he said. She turned the question over. She thought about the answer she could give, and the answer that was true, and the distance between them, which was not very far, which was another thing that had changed. "You," she said. The word arrived in the room with a weight that she had intended, but which was still startling to hear in her own voice. Adrian said nothing. He was very still in the way he was still when he was not suppressing a reaction, but genuinely receiving something, processing it at a depth that showed on the surface only as stillness. "I came here on a wrong number," Emily said. "I came here hurt and scared and with nowhere else to go, and you gave me a room with a lock on the inside and soup and someone to look at my ribs." She paused. "And then it became something else, something I didn't choose and didn't plan and don't entirely know what to do with." She looked at him. "That's what's keeping me from knowing when I'm leaving. I'm trying to figure out what this is before I walk out of it." "What do you think it is?" he said. "I think you know what it is," she said. "I think you've known longer than I have, which is saying something because I've known for a while. A silence. Not uncomfortable. Or not only uncomfortable, the kind of silence that has content to it." Adrian stood up. He moved to the fireplace and stood with one hand on the mantel, looking at the fire, and for a moment he was in profile to her. The clean angles of his face in the firelight, the line of his shoulder, the particular quality of a powerful man standing at the edge of something he doesn't fully control. "I don't do this," he said. His voice was quiet. "This..." He stopped, chose different words. "People in my life occupy specific positions. They are people I trust operationally, people I am responsible for, people I'm in opposition to. Those are the categories." He paused. "You don't fit any of them." "What category do I fit?" Emily said. He turned and looked at her. "I don't have one," he said. "That's the problem." She held his gaze. "Or maybe that's the point," she said. The fire settled in the grate with a small, soft sound. Emily. Her name, in his voice, with the precise weight he always gave it. "I need you to understand something about what I am. Not as a warning, you know what I am. You've been inside the architecture of it for 3 weeks, and you've earned the right to call it by its name. But because I need you to understand what it would mean." He moved back to the chair. Not sitting in it, but standing beside it, which was, she had come to understand, his version of not committing to stillness. "This life, this world. What happened at the warehouse, that is not an unusual event in the context of what I do. It's an escalation of an unusual event, yes, but the underlying category of it, violence, threat, people using people as leverage, that is the texture of this." He looked at her. "I have spent years trying to change that texture, moving things toward legitimate operations. And I will keep doing it, and I will get there, but I'm not there yet, and I can't promise you a timeline." His jaw was doing the thing she'd learned to read. "What I can tell you is that you would be in that world, not as a bystander. You've already proven that you can't be a bystander, which is both the thing I respect most about you and the thing that terrifies me most about you in the same breath." Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought about Daniel's apartment 14 months ago, about the voice in her head that had said, "This is fine," for so long that she'd almost stopped being able to hear the other voice, the one that knew better. She thought about the difference between that, staying out of fear of what leaving would cost, and this. This was something else. This required a different kind of accounting. "You know what I've been through," she said. "You know what the last year looked like. Before the floor, before the wrong number, the whole year of it." "I know." "Well, so you know that I have a very specific understanding of what it means to stay in a situation because you're afraid." She met his eyes. "And I have a very specific understanding of what it looks like when that's not what's happening." She paused. "This is not what's happening." He looked at her with those dark, level eyes. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm a little afraid," she said. "That's different from afraid being the reason." Something moved across his face, the compressed thing, but deeper than she'd seen it before, less guarded, closer to the surface. He crossed the room in 4 steps and sat down on the coffee table in front of her, which put them at the same level, closer than the careful choreography of the past weeks had allowed. She could see the details of him that proximity revealed. The fine scar above his left eyebrow she'd noticed weeks ago, the new one on his forearm from the warehouse, the slight unevenness in the bridge of his nose that suggested it had been broken at some point in the past and had healed on its own terms. "If you stay," he said, "I need you to stay for what it is. Not for what you think it might become. Not for the version of it that's easier than the reality." His voice was very quiet. "I've watched people try to live in this world as though the difficult parts are temporary. They're not always temporary." "I know that," Emily said. "Do you?" "I work at a port terminal," she said. "I've been processing your shipping documentation for 2 years without knowing it. I've been in the geography of your world for longer than I've been in your house." She paused. "I'm not arriving here from somewhere else and imagining I can redecorate. I'm telling you I see what it is and I'm making a choice about it. That's different." He was very close. The fire was warm at her side. "What's the choice?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the room she'd been storing things in, the door she'd been keeping carefully closed. She thought about 11 days of soup and locked guest rooms and midnight kitchens and a garden in gray light and a man who had knocked 3 times and meant it. She thought about what it cost to say a true thing out loud and what it cost not to. "I'm choosing this," she said. "Whatever this is. I'm choosing it with eyes open." She paused. "The question is whether you are." Adrian was still, completely still, in the way he was still at his deepest. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the grammar of a movie moment. He simply reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. And the warmth of it was so ordinary and so significant at the same time that Emily felt it travel up her arm and into her chest and lodge itself there in a place that had been empty for a long time. "I've been choosing this," he said quietly, "since the night you opened a door I told you not to open." She turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his. They sat like that in the firelight, not performing anything for anyone, just 2 people who had arrived at a true thing by an improbable route, holding it carefully. Outside, it started raining again. Softly this time, without aggression, the kind of rain that doesn't demand anything. It ran down the sitting room windows in thin lines. Inside, the fire was warm and the lamp was on, and the house was quiet, in the particular way it was quiet when the people inside it were where they were supposed to be. She stayed. She stayed not because she had to, and not because she was afraid, and not because leaving was harder than staying. She stayed because she had looked at what was in front of her with clear eyes and made a clear decision, and the decision was yes. The weeks that followed had the specific quality of something that has been declared and is now being built. Not easily. Nothing about the situation allowed for easy, and neither of them was the kind of person who wanted easy more than they wanted real. There were difficult conversations, the kind that 2 people have when they are coming from different places and trying to find common ground that holds. Emily was direct in the way that she had always been, but had learned to suppress. She said the things she thought, even the difficult ones. And Adrian, who had spent years in a world where honesty was a tactical decision rather than a default, was sometimes surprised by it and was always, she came to understand, grateful for it even when it was uncomfortable. There were things she asked him about that he answered carefully, and things she asked him about that he answered fully, and things she asked him about where he said plainly that he wasn't ready, and she respected that because she understood the difference between someone who was hiding from you and someone who was moving toward you at the pace they were capable of. She moved back to her apartment. That had its own significance. It was a choice, which made it different from a necessity. She chose to live in her own space and spend time in his space, and have the 2 things be separate and connected simultaneously, which was what she needed, what her own healing required. She needed to know that her apartment was hers again, not a place of terror, not the floor and the door and the sound of his footsteps, but a home she had chosen and could choose to be in. It took a few weeks, and then, without fanfare, it was. The Murano situation resolved with the slow, legal complexity that Adrian had predicted. There were conversations with people Emily was never introduced to, and documentation that passed through channels she never asked about, and outcomes that were reported to her in general terms. Murano was contained, not destroyed, Not ended in the way that this world sometimes ended things, but bounded and diminished in a way that rendered him a manageable problem rather than an existential one. There would be more Muranos. That was the nature of the territory. Adrian said so plainly, and Emily accepted it plainly, and they moved forward. Vivian met Adrian in the 5th week. The meeting was, Emily reflected afterward, exactly what it needed to be. Slightly awkward, ultimately honest, and ultimately fine. Vivian was protective and direct and did not bother to perform anything about her skepticism. And Adrian met her skepticism with a directness that surprised Vivian more than any charm would have. He didn't explain himself, didn't perform. When Vivian said over coffee in a place that was neither his territory nor Emily's apartment, but somewhere neutral, "You understand my concern," Adrian said. "Yes, it's justified. I'd have the same concern." Vivian looked at him for a long moment and then looked at Emily and said, "Okay," in the tone that meant, "I'm watching. I'm not convinced, but I'm here." That was enough. It was real, and it was enough. What Emily had not expected in the accounting she'd done before making her choice was how much she would find herself becoming something. Not being made into something by Adrian or by the circumstances, she rejected that framing because it gave away a causality she didn't believe. But in the context of this life, in the act of choosing it and navigating it and bringing herself fully into it, she found that parts of her that had been quiet for a long time were not quiet anymore. She went back to work and she was better at it. Not technically. Technically, she had always been good, but she was better in the room. She spoke in meetings in a way she hadn't before. She contradicted a shipping manager twice in the same week and was right both times and didn't apologize for it. Her supervisor noticed. She noticed her supervisor noticing. She talked to Claudia every few days by text and sometimes in person. Claudia had started quietly and without announcement, spending time at a women's shelter 2 neighborhoods from the house, not officially, not as a program or a philanthropic designation, just going, sitting with people, talking to them, because she understood something about being frightened and being held and finding your feet again. She didn't make a thing of it. It was just something she was doing. Emily watched this and thought about the woman who had asked a captor's guard for his name and the story of his scar. She thought about the ways people turned what happened to them into a resource for other people, and how that was different from performing survival, and how it was, in fact, the only kind of recovery that put anything back into the world. It was on an evening in the 5th week, sitting in the garden after dinner, the garden that was beginning now to show the earliest hesitant signs of spring, a few brave shoots pushing up through the soil along the south wall, that Adrian said something that changed the shape of what she was thinking. He had been quieter than usual all evening, not withdrawn. She had learned to distinguish the two, but interior, working through something. "I want to talk to you about the business," he said. She looked at him. "Which part of it?" "The part that comes next." He looked at the garden. "I've been thinking about a timeline, the legitimate transition. The businesses I've been moving toward legal operation. I have lawyers and I have accountants and I have a structure that works at the pace I've been running it." He paused. "I want to run it faster." Emily was quiet, watching the side of his face. "What changed?" she said. He looked at her. "The warehouse. And before the warehouse." He said it simply. "I've been managing toward a destination for years, moving things incrementally. And what happened at Pier 17? With Claudia, with you." He stopped, started differently. "I understand better now what it costs. The pace I've been moving at assumes a future I can't guarantee at this pace. And I'd rather—" He paused on the next words, the way a man pauses on something he has to mean in order to say it. "I'd rather get there while the people I want to share it with are still here." Emily looked at the garden, at the small shoots along the south wall. "What does moving faster look like?" she said. "It looks like choices," he said. "Choices that cost something. Stepping back from revenue streams that are profitable and illegal in ways I've been maintaining because the transition costs were high. They're not going to get lower." He paused. "It looks like exposing myself to a period of operational vulnerability because I'm changing the structure during a time when the structure is already under pressure. From Morano's remaining people," she said, "and others." He was direct about it. "It will be a difficult period, a year, possibly 2. And on the other side of it," he stopped again. "On the other side of it is something I actually want to live in." She thought about what he was describing, the specific kind of courage it required. Not the courage of the warehouse, the adrenaline-sharpened decision-making in a moment of crisis. The other kind. The kind that got up every morning and made choices with long-term consequences in the absence of the clarity that emergency provides. "I want to help," she said. He looked at her. "I know the port," she said. "I know the logistics infrastructure better than most people in your operation. I know the legitimate side of it and the illegitimate side of it, and how the documentation works and where the gaps are and how to close them." She met his eyes. "Let me help build what comes next." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not a small thing," he said. "What I'd be asking—" "You didn't ask," she said. "I offered." She paused. "There's a difference." The almost smile, deeper than it had ever been. "There is a difference," he said. The garden was quiet around them. The early spring evening was cold, but not harshly so. The kind of cold that felt like something retreating rather than something advancing. Somewhere past the garden wall, the city made its continuous sound. Emily thought about a wrong number sent from a cracked phone on a kitchen floor, and about the strange, improbable geometry of consequence. How one thing connects to another and then to another in ways that no map could have predicted. How the most significant coordinates in a life are sometimes found not through intention, but through the honest response to a single, terrifying moment. She thought about the room she'd been storing things in, and how it was not a storage room anymore. She thought about what she had, and what she was building, and who she was building it with. She looked at him, at the line of his profile against the failing light, at the particular quality of a powerful man who was in the process of choosing something stronger than power. She reached out and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers. They sat in the garden while the last of the light went out of the sky, not talking, not needing to. Inside the house, they could hear Claudia's voice from the kitchen. She was on the phone, laughing at something, the bright and unguarded sound of a person who was alive and whole and making her way back to herself. Emily listened to that sound. She felt Adrian's hand around hers. She thought, this is what it feels like when you choose something real. And outside the garden wall, the city kept its ordinary business. Indifferent and continuous and full of lives that were finding their shapes in ways no map could predict, through wrong numbers and cracked screens and 3 knocks on broken doors, and the improbable, irreversible mercy of someone who comes. Spring arrived in the city the way it always did, not all at once, not with any single definitive morning, but through accumulation. A degree warmer, an hour more of light. The bare branches along the garden wall putting out their first tentative leaves, small and pale and serious about it. Emily noticed all of it. She had become over these months a person who noticed things she had not noticed before. Or perhaps she had always noticed them, and the noticing had simply been crowded out by the constant, exhausting work of managing fear. Now that the fear had largely vacated, there was space. The garden, the quality of morning light through the kitchen window. The way the city sounded different on a Saturday than on a Tuesday, a texture to it she had never registered when every day was spent navigating the same internal landscape of watchfulness and dread. She was not the same person she had been on that kitchen floor. She knew this not in the dramatic, declarative way of someone narrating their own transformation, but in the quiet, practical way of someone who notices that a task which used to cost everything now costs very little. She walked into rooms without positioning herself near the exit. She heard unexpected sounds without her heart immediately recalibrating to threat. She reached for what she wanted in a conversation and said it directly, without first running it through the filter of how will this land, what will it cost me, is it worth it? It was worth it. That was the thing she had learned, at some point between the wrong number and the garden and the fire and the hand in hers. Things that were true were worth saying. People who were real were worth choosing. A life that was actually hers was worth building, even when the building was difficult, even when the foundation was still being renegotiated in parts. The transition had been difficult in exactly the ways Adrian had predicted. He had said a year, possibly 2. The first 9 months delivered on that forecast without apology. They were months of complex legal architecture, of carefully unwinding operational structures that had been built over years of accumulated decisions, of lawyers and accountants and quiet conversations in offices that Emily was sometimes present for and sometimes not. There were moments of tension that she recognized from the quality of the house, from the compressed efficiency with which Adrian moved through certain days, from the way Reyes occasionally looked at her with the expression of someone performing a real-time assessment of how much information was helpful and how much was burden. Emily had been clear about this from the beginning. "I don't want to be managed," she had told Adrian, in one of those direct conversations that he had come to trust as much as he found them initially uncomfortable. "I don't want information withheld from me because someone decided I couldn't handle it. I can handle it. I'd rather know." He had looked at her for a long moment. Then, "It will worry you." "Being kept in the dark worries me more," she said. "I spent 14 months telling myself things were fine because I didn't want to look at what was actually in front of me. I don't do that anymore." He understood that. He respected it in the particular way he respected things, not with words, but by changing his behavior. The information came. Not all of it, not the operational details that were genuinely not hers to carry, but the shape of things, the honest status reports, the unvarnished version of where the transition was and what it was costing. What it was costing in those first 9 months was significant. 3 of the port operations were closed entirely, legitimate on paper, but structurally dependent on arrangements that could not survive scrutiny, and Adrian had made the decision that scrutiny was coming regardless and that it was better to choose the ending than to have it chosen. The Eastern Corridor holdings, the ones that had intersected with Murano's territory, were sold off through a process that Emily helped structure because she understood the logistics of the port infrastructure in ways that the lawyers did not. That had been her contribution. Not dramatic, not heroic, nothing like the North Door and the red-handled switch. Just competence, applied consistently, in the direction of something real. Reyes had told her around the 6th month without ceremony and without making a large thing of it, "You're good at this." Emily had looked up from the documentation she was reviewing. "The logistics?" "All of it," Reyes said. She paused, in the way Reyes paused when she was deciding whether to say the rest of what she was thinking, which Emily had learned to wait out because the rest was usually worth having. "I've watched a lot of people try to exist in this world from the outside. Most of them either get absorbed by it and stop being who they were, or they stay on the outside and it costs the relationship." She looked at Emily directly. "You found a third thing." "What's the third thing?" Emily said. "You're in it without being of it," Reyes said. "You're helping build the version that comes after. That's different." She picked up her own stack of documents. "It matters. I wanted you to know that." Emily thought about that for a long time after. The moment with Victor Murano came in the 9th month, and it came in the form of a legal filing rather than a confrontation, which was both anticlimactic and entirely appropriate. Murano had been, true to Claudia's description, patient. His containment after Pier 17 had been real but not absolute, and in the months that followed he had made several careful, probing moves. Not violent, not direct, but the kind of pressure that a man with lawyers and financial resources and a grudge applies over time. He had challenged 2 of the property transfers. He had filed a regulatory complaint against the port operations that Adrian was legitimizing, citing procedural irregularities that were technically accurate and entirely bad faith. He had, in the particular way of men who cannot accept that a thing has been decided, kept finding new expressions of his unwillingness to accept it. The regulatory complaint was the one that required Emily directly. It was built on an interpretation of the Port Authority documentation that was wrong. She knew it was wrong because she had written the documentation, 3 years of it, and she understood exactly what the filing meant and exactly how Murano's lawyers had deliberately misread it. She spent 3 days building the response with the focused, methodical energy of someone doing the thing they are genuinely best at. She cross-referenced 4 years of filing history. She produced a documentation trail that was so thorough and so clear that when the Port Authority reviewed it, the complaint was dismissed within a week. Murano's lawyer called Adrian's lawyer and said, with the professional neutrality of someone delivering a message they were paid to deliver, "Our client acknowledges the resolution and considers the matter closed." Adrian relayed this to Emily in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, with the compact, quiet satisfaction of someone reporting a concluded operation. "That's it?" Emily said. "That's it," Adrian said. She looked at him. "You're sure?" His leverage was the regulatory angle. Without it, the other challenges don't hold. And Murano understands resource allocation. He won't keep spending on a position that can't win. He paused. He's patient, not irrational. Emily was quiet for a moment. She thought about the car parked outside the dock, 6 evenings in a row. The photograph in the file, the way Claudia had described him. He comes to things like a tide. It feels too clean, she said. It is clean, Adrian said. You made it clean. The documentation you built was unassailable. There was no creative interpretation that held up against it. He looked at her steadily. Sometimes things end because you did the work well enough that there's nothing left to fight. She sat with that for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. And Victor Morano, patient and title and finally without shore, receded. Claudia's work at the shelter had, by the 9th month, stopped being a quiet, unofficial thing and become something else. It happened gradually, and it happened because Claudia was Claudia, because she asked the guard for his name and the story of his scar, because she sat with frightened people and asked them ordinary questions, and created, through the consistent force of her own refusal to look away, a space where they could be ordinary people rather than circumstances to be managed. The shelter director had asked her, sometime around the 5th month, if she would consider formalizing her involvement. Claudia had thought about it for 2 weeks, and then said yes, with the condition that she be allowed to develop a specific program, not therapy, not case management, but something more lateral, a peer support model built on the understanding that the most effective thing you could offer someone who had been frightened and controlled was the company of someone who had also been frightened and controlled and had found their way back to themselves. She was building it now. It had a name. She had told Emily the name on an afternoon in the kitchen, slightly shy about it in the way that people are shy about things they care about most. The Anchor Program. Because, Claudia had explained, when you've been in water that's trying to take you somewhere you don't want to go, what you need first is not a destination. What you need is something to hold. Emily had looked at her across the kitchen table and felt something she couldn't entirely contain. That's right, she said. That's exactly right. Claudia had looked down at her coffee, smiling in the private way of someone who has just heard a thing they needed to hear confirmed. Adrian's going to help fund it, Claudia said. He was going to before I asked. I let him tell me about it like it was his idea. She glanced up. He needs to think he's taking care of things. He's taking care of things, Emily said. Yes, Claudia said. But he needs to think he thought of it first. She paused. It's a small thing. I allow him the small things. Emily laughed. Actually laughed. The body-involved, surprised kind. Does he know you do that? Claudia picked up her mug with an expression of complete serenity. Absolutely not, she said. The day that Emily thought of, later, as the day the transition completed. Not the legal completion, which came with filings and signatures and a quiet dinner with the lawyers who had spent 9 months building the new structure. But the real completion, the one she felt in her body, was an ordinary Tuesday in late spring. She had been at the terminal all morning, back in her full-time role now, and the day had been busy in the satisfying way of days when the logistics actually work. Cargo moving on schedule, documentation clean, the particular pleasure of a system functioning with the efficiency it was designed for. She had eaten lunch at her desk and had a good conversation with a colleague who had started 2 months ago and was learning the filing system and had asked Emily 3 questions that were genuinely good questions, the kind that came from someone who was actually thinking about the work rather than performing familiarity with it. She came to the house in the late afternoon, which was the rhythm they had found. Her apartment, his house, the movement between them feeling less like a negotiation and more like breathing, the natural back and forth of 2 lives that were separate and connected and comfortable with both. She let herself in with the key she'd had for 4 months. The house was quiet, in the particular mid-afternoon way it was quiet when operations were calm. She went to the kitchen, poured water, looked at the garden through the window. The garden was full now, properly full. The south wall covered in something climbing and pale green, the beds along the path showing the structured abundance of things that had been well tended through winter and were now repaying the attention. She thought about the first time she'd seen it, bare and winter still, standing at the same window in the early morning of her second day here, trying to locate herself in the situation she was in. She was located now. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps in the corridor, the particular rhythm of them that she had learned the way you learn a language, not through study, but through immersion. He came into the kitchen and found her at the window and stopped for a moment in the doorway in the way he sometimes did, as though the sight of her in his kitchen required a beat of adjustment, a moment to account for the fact that this was real. She turned around. He looked different than he had 9 months ago. Not dramatically. He was not a man who changed dramatically or externally. The change was in the quality of him. The control was still there, but it was no longer doing the work of containment. It was just precision now. The natural economy of a person who thinks clearly, undisguised by the constant managed effort of keeping something heavy from being visible. He looked like a man who had put something down. The Reinhold transfer finalized this morning, he said. He said it with the quiet simplicity of someone delivering a piece of information they have been carrying for a long time and are glad to set down. The Reinhold holdings, the last of the major operational structures that had required restructuring, had been the final piece of the legal transition. 9 months of careful, painstaking work, and this morning it had been done. Emily looked at him. "How do you feel?" she said. He thought about that for a moment. Actually thought about it, which was something that had changed. The willingness to sit with the question rather than route around it. "Like something I've been carrying for a very long time just got lighter," he said. She crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of him. She looked at his face, the scar above the eyebrow, the one on his forearm, the particular architecture of a man who had been in difficult places and had come through them and had chosen, finally and deliberately, to come through them toward something rather than simply away from something. "It should feel like that," she said, "because that's what it is." He reached up and put his hand against her face, in the careful, deliberate way he touched things he valued, not tentatively, but with full attention. She turned her cheek slightly into his palm. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "All right." "Not today," he said. "Soon. When the timing is—" He stopped. Something in his expression was doing a thing she hadn't seen before. A new kind of openness, or the old kind at a new depth. "I've been thinking about what comes next. Not operationally, personally." He held her gaze. "I want to talk to you about it when I found the right words." Emily looked at him. She thought about what the right words meant, coming from a man who had spent most of his adult life not saying the interior ones. She understood that he was telling her something. Not asking, not proposing, not declaring, just telling her that he was building towards something and wanted her to know it was coming. "Take your time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." The almost smile, but warmer than it had ever been. The kind that reached the parts of his face that the controlled version didn't. "I know," he said. "That's the thing." Well, dinner that evening was loud in the way that dinners in that house were loud when things were well. Claudia had come with the news about the Anchor program's first official intake of participants, which she delivered with the barely contained energy of someone who had built something and was watching it start to work. And Reyes had arrived unexpectedly with a bottle of something she'd been saving and said she'd heard about the Reinhold finalization and that was worth acknowledging. And Marco had smiled in the rare, genuine way that transformed his face into something that looked surprised by its own happiness. And Lena had made 3 dishes when 2 would have been sufficient, and was satisfied about this. Emily sat at the table and looked around it. She thought about the first dinner here, the first time they had all sat together, Claudia's taxi story, the laughing that had surprised her with its realness. She thought about how she had looked up from the laughing and found Adrian watching her, and the thing that had been in his expression then, which she had filed away in the room she was keeping carefully closed. The room was open now, had been open for a long time, and what she found inside it, when she finally looked, was nothing like what she had been afraid to find. It was not danger. It was not the kind of feeling that diminished you or swallowed you or required you to make yourself smaller to survive inside it. It was the opposite of that. It was the feeling of being exactly the size she was, in a place that was exactly the right size for her. She looked at Claudia, who was gesturing emphatically about something to Reyes, who was listening with the expression of someone who has been thoroughly convinced of something but is not going to admit it immediately. She looked at Marco, refilling everyone's glasses with the quiet attentiveness that was simply who he was. She looked at Lena, who caught her eye across the table and gave her the small particular nod that meant, "I see you. You're well. This is as it should be." And she looked at Adrian, who was watching Claudia with an expression that was completely unguarded, the older brother whose sister was alive and whole, and building something that mattered. The man who had put down the heavy thing this morning, the man who had knocked 3 times and kept his word, the man who had looked at her on a kitchen floor and decided she was worth coming for. He felt her looking and turned. Their eyes met across the table. He didn't perform anything, didn't look away, didn't manage it. Just met her gaze with the full direct quality of his attention and held it. She held it back. They had a language now, the two of them, built from months of ordinary moments and extraordinary ones, from kitchens at midnight and gardens in gray light and warehouses and document filings, and the gradual, irreversible work of two people who had decided to be honest with each other about what was real. In that language, what passed between them across the dinner table was a complete sentence. The weeks that followed had the quality of things being built rather than managed, a distinction that Emily had learned to feel in her body. The difference between the tense, forward-leaning work of maintaining a precarious situation and the different, more spacious work of constructing something meant to last. The Anchor program opened its doors officially on a Thursday in early summer, in a space that Claudia had found and Adrian had funded and Emily had helped structure operationally, because running a support program had more in common with logistics than most people understood. The scheduling, the resource allocation, the documentation, the architecture of systems that had to be reliable, because the people depending on them had already experienced too much unreliability. Emily was there on the first day, not as a director or an official presence, but because Claudia had asked her to be. "You're part of the reason this exists," Claudia had said, with the directness that was simply how she was. "You're allowed to be there when it starts." Emily had looked at her. "How am I part of the reason this exists?" Claudia had looked back with the expression she wore when she thought the answer was obvious. "Because of what happened to you," she said. "Not just the floor, not just Daniel, the whole year. The way you survived it, and then kept going, and then came into our kitchen and helped save my life with a master key and a regulation from 4 years ago." She paused. "That's what this program is for. For people who have that in them and need somewhere to land while they figure out how to use it." She paused again, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter. "You were that person, Emily. Now you're the other kind. That matters to the people who are still the first kind." Emily stood in the doorway of the Anchor program on its first Thursday and watched people arrive. Carefully, tentatively, the particular way people arrive at places they need but are not entirely sure they're allowed to need. And she felt something in her chest that was not sadness and was not joy exactly, but was something that encompassed both. Something that knew the territory being walked. She thought about the checklist articles at 2 in the morning, the practice distance from a door with a familiar key, the floor and the cracked phone and the rain. She thought about what it meant that something built in the aftermath of those things was now opening its doors for other people who were in the middle of theirs. She stayed for 2 hours. She talked to 3 people. She didn't say anything about her own history. It wasn't the time and they weren't there for her story, but she listened to theirs with the quality of attention that she had learned from someone who used it like an instrument. And she was told, by a woman who had been there an hour, that she was easy to talk to. She thanked her. She meant it. She walked out into the summer afternoon and called Adrian. He picked up on the second ring. "How was it?" "It was right," she said. She was standing on the sidewalk outside the program with the afternoon sun warm on her face, the city moving around her in its ordinary, continuous way. "The whole thing. It's exactly right." A pause. She could hear the quality of his listening, the full attending silence that she had come to love as much as anything he said. "Good," he said, and in his voice was everything the word was carrying: Claudia and the months of work, and the thing that had been built in the aftermath of what had been survived. "I'm coming to you," she said. "I'll be in the garden," he said. She walked. It was a good day for walking. The city was warm and clear, and the streets had the specific summer quality of a place that has been cold for a long time and is taking pleasure in not being cold anymore. She walked through neighborhoods she knew and ones she was still learning, and she thought about what she was walking toward, and she felt no complicated thing about it. No negotiation, no need to run the calculation of what it cost and what it returned. She just walked toward him. That was all. He was in the garden where he'd said he'd be, standing at the far end near the south wall that was fully covered now in the climbing things that had been bare when she first saw it. He heard her on the path and turned, and for a moment he was just there. Himself. In the late afternoon light, in the garden they had stood in through winter and spring and into summer. The man he had always been and the man he was becoming, both of those things visible at once. She reached him. They stood together at the south wall, the way they had stood together through all the seasons of it. And the city made its sounds on the other side of the wall, and the garden was warm, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he said, "I found the words." She looked at him. "The ones I told you I was looking for," he said. He was looking at the garden, at the climbing plants, at the particular pale gold quality of the late afternoon light. Then he turned and looked at her, and his eyes were direct and completely clear. "I've been thinking about what I want the rest of it to look like. The actual rest of it, not the next phase or the next operational structure. The life." He paused. "I want it to look like this. You, here, this. I want it to be permanent. I want to ask you to make it permanent." He looked at her steadily. "I want to marry you." The garden was very quiet. Emily looked at him, at everything she had learned to read in his face, the precision and the depth and the things that had been closed and were open now. She thought about the wrong number. She thought about the 3 knocks. She thought about soup and a locked door and a garden in winter and a warehouse and a red-handled switch and dinner tables loud with the sound of people who had chosen each other. She thought about what she had been on that floor and what she was in this garden, and the distance between those two things, which was the whole story. "Yes," she said. Not elaborated, not decorated. Just the word, clean and complete. The way true things were when you stopped being afraid of them. He took her hand. He held it the way he held things he valued, with his complete attention. She looked at their hands and then at his face, and the thing she saw there was the thing she had been watching develop for months. Peace. The specific, hard-won peace of a person who has put down something heavy and found that the world continues, that they continue, that the thing they were afraid to be without was in fact only ever a weight. "I have something else," he said. She looked at him. He reached into his jacket and produced something small, a ring, which he held with the same careful, full attention quality he brought to everything he valued. It was simple, which surprised her until it didn't. A single stone, the kind of thing that didn't announce itself, but that caught the light when you moved. The kind of thing chosen by someone who knew the difference between display and meaning. "It was my mother's," he said, "before everything. Before the empire and the weight of it, and all the years of what it became." He paused. "It belongs to a version of the family that existed before all of that. I want it to belong to the version that comes after." She looked at the ring. She thought about what it meant to be handed the before and the after simultaneously, to be trusted with both the history and the future in a single small object. She held out her hand. He put it on. It fit with the slight, almost ceremonial imprecision of something not yet fully settled, still finding its place. She looked at it on her hand. "It belongs here," she said. He looked at her with the full, unheld quality of his expression at its deepest, the face of a man who has finally stopped managing the distance between what he feels and what he shows. "Yes," he said. "It does." They stayed in the garden until the light was gone, and then they went inside to the warm kitchen where Lena was cooking something that smelled like it would be excellent, and where Claudia arrived 20 minutes later and looked at Emily's hand and produced a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, and was entirely herself, and where Marco opened something from the back of a cabinet that he said was for significant occasions, and where Reyes looked at the ring and then at Emily with the expression that was her version of profound and unreserved approval. And they ate dinner, all of them, in the house that had become a home, in the loud and ordinary and irreplaceable way of people who have chosen each other. Later, much later, when the table had been cleared and Claudia had gone, and Marco had locked up, and Lena had made her commentary on the evening's proceedings, and departed with the satisfaction of someone whose patient had made a full recovery, Emily and Adrian sat in the sitting room with the lamp on. The lamp he had dimmed for her, the first night, which was a detail she had never told him she remembered, and which she suspected he remembered too. She was reading. He was not pretending to read a file. Outside, the city was doing its late-night things. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals. "Tell me something," she said. He looked up. That night, she said. The message. When it came in and you realized it was a wrong number. What made you reply? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, but actually thinking about it, which was his way. I was in the car, he said, coming back from something I'd rather not specify. It was late. My phone lit up and I looked at it and it said, he paused, I need help. I'm at my apartment. Please come. Something happened. He looked at the Coles. I didn't know you. I didn't know the number. And I sat in the car and I thought, this person is somewhere on the other end of this message, waiting to see if the world is the kind of place that responds. Emily was very still. And I thought, he said, that I wanted to be in the kind of world where it does. He looked at her. So I responded. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the world being the kind of place where someone responds. She thought about everything that had followed from that. The 3 knocks, the car, the soup, the garden, the warehouse, the ring. All of it proceeding from a single decision made in a car by a man who had decided, in one clear moment, what kind of world he wanted to be part of. Thank you, she said. He looked at her with the full, direct clarity of his attention. For what? For deciding, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, thank you for opening the door. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that reached everywhere. It was your door, she said. It was your choice, he said. Outside, the city breathed through the summer night. Inside, the lamp was warm and the coals were low, and 2 people sat in the ordinary, extraordinary piece of a life that had been built from a wrong number and 3 knocks and the accumulated weight of small, true things. The ring caught the lamplight when she turned the page. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him, at the man he had been and the man he was and the man he would be, all of those versions present and accounted for, none of them hidden, all of them hers to know. She turned the page. He watched the coals. The city kept on, and the story that had started with the worst night of her life had arrived, by the most improbable route imaginable. At this, a room with a lamp on and a fire going out, and a man and a woman who had found each other through a crack in a phone screen and decided, against all reasonable probability, to stay. It had all begun with a message sent to the wrong number, and it had led, as wrong numbers sometimes do when the world is the kind of place where people respond, to exactly the right place.